Good morning. We'll call the meeting to order. We're here this morning to continue our posture hearings in preparation for the 2021 NDAA. And this morning we will hear from the Department of the Air Force and the Space Force Command on the budget request for their departments, the President's budget request from FY21. We are joined by the Honorable Barbara Barrett, Secretary of the Air Force, and it is her first time before our committee, so welcome. And look forward to your testimony. General David Goldfein, who's the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and in all likelihood, this may well be your last time before the committee. So the beginnings and the endings, and we certainly appreciate your service and also your consistent candor before this committee and in working with us so well over your time as the Chief of Staff. We appreciate that leadership. And we are joined by General John Raymond, Chief of Space Operations for the U.S. Space Force. Not only is this his first time before the committee, but it is the first time having a representative from the U.S. Space Force and the newly created U.S. Space Force. So we're very anxious to hear from you about how the setup of that is going. I thank our witnesses for being here, and I think that the challenge going forward, which we've talked about a lot in this committee, is, as always happens with arms, so you're consistently asked to do more than you have the resources to do. And how you manage that, I think, is the great challenge at the Pentagon right now in terms of, how do we figure out maybe to get more resources? How do we figure out to perhaps change what the strategy is to better match those resources? But in doing that, there is considerable risk in terms of how we make sure that we're prepared for what it is that we do choose to do. And I was particularly interested in the study that you did, I think came out that said you have roughly 319 squadrons and you'd like to have 386. And the trouble with that is you are highly unlikely to get 386. So I worry about what that means in terms of what our actual plan is and our ability to execute it. If we set up and say, well, we have to have this much and we don't, then we're sort of scrambling around, unable to truly be prepared for any mission, since we're trying to prepare for more missions than we can possibly do, if that makes sense. I'd like to know how we rationalize that. And also something that has come up consistently is, so that's how many squadrons you want, but just with our discussion of ships and this mythical number of ships that at some point in the future we're going to have, the truly important thing is how many of our squadrons, or ships for that matter, are operational. And that seems to have been a major challenge. We get consistent reports about, pick an airframe. There we have, 110 of them, but on any given day, only 60 of them are ready to go. Is there a way to improve that? And what are you focused on to make sure that if we have the actual piece of equipment, that it works? Because that is a frustrating misuse of resources if you have something and you can't get it to do what it is supposed to do. Along those lines, one of the ways that we've tried to rationalize the irrational situation I just described is by relying excessively on the OCO. One of my all-time favorite things was the phrase they came up with last year, where they actually eliminated the subterfuge and came up with something that they called FOCO. Fake OCO, just being very honest about it. We just, we want this money. We don't want to put it on the budget because we, have budget caps to deal with. So we're going to call it emergency funding so it can be, quote, off budget, unquote. And the Air Force relies quite a bit on that. I forget the statistics off the top of my head. I think it's like $21.6 billion in OCO for the Air Force. And the estimates were, I think less than $2 billion that was for actual overseas contingency operations. So, how you plan to not rely on that long term is enormously important. And tied into all of this, as a number of members I'm sure will raise, is the bitter irony that we also get your unfunded requirements list, while at the same time we just had the $3.8 billion reprogramming, where money, for instance, was taken out of the F-35 program to go to the wall, which, as Ms. Davis helpfully pointed out in an earlier hearing, is not in the National Defense Strategy at all. We are supposed to build the Pentagon budget and our strategy based on the National Defense Strategy. It doesn't say anything in there about money for a southern border wall, and yet we're going to take the money out of our programs, put it in there, and then come back to us and say, oh, it's an unfunded requirement. It's like, no, it was funded. You took the money and spent it someplace else. That is an enormous problem, and it is causing problems at the Department of Defense, and we should not simply let that go by. And then there is the Space Force. And I will tell you, I I've always been fairly ambivalent about that. At the end of the day, I trusted Mr. Rogers and Mr. Cooper as the two chairs of the committee that created it, and I also trust the fundamental idea behind it, and that is that space is central to everything we do. It is the center of our command and control structure that it makes almost everything we do within the military operate. It deserved to have a special segment to make sure that we are training the people who work in that arena properly and for that mission. And I get that, and I understand that, and I think it is a reasonable thing to do. The concern is it just another bureaucracy? Do we get a better, more focused look at how we take care of our space needs within national defense? Or do we get a bunch more generals, a lot more staff doing basically the same thing? And I think, General Raymond, that is your great challenge, is to make sure that it works in an efficient and effective way and isn't just another bureaucracy. And with that, I will yield to the ranking member, Mr. Thornberry, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me join in welcoming each of our witnesses today. And if this should be General Goldfein's last appearance before the committee, I also want to thank him and Don for both of your service to the country over a long period. It has been exceptional, and not just in your current position, and we are very grateful for all that both of you have done. There's no question this is a challenging time for the Air Force, not just because much of what we talk about when we say great power competition falls on y'all's shoulders, but also because there's this internal change going on at the same time. Now, we've dealt with such situations before, such as the end of World War II, and came out pretty well. But it is a challenging time for each of you. And like we talked about a bit last week with the Navy, I think what's most helpful is if we can have a, not necessarily every detail laid out, but a plan, an approach going forward. Now, that's particularly true when it comes to space, because you're a new organization. We're all beginning to think of space in different ways as a warfighting domain, and we need that sort of vision about where we ought to go. But it's also true with the Air Force. The controversy over the last week was somebody saying we don't need any manned fighters anymore, and technology is changing. Adversaries are changing, and so this vision of where we move forward, to me, is just as important as this particular year's budget request. They need, obviously, to go together, but as I say, there's a lot on y'all's plates, but I have full confidence in your ability to deal with it. Thanks for being here. I yield back.
Thank you. Secretary Barrett, or I'm assuming you're going first. Go ahead.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, members of the committee, thank you for inviting us to appear before you today. I'm especially privileged to be joined by two exemplary chiefs, Chief Goldfein on what may be his last appearance before this committee as the Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, and the exemplary Chief Jay Raymond, who is the Chief of Space Operations and leading that in its stand-up. The international security environment changes unpredictably. China and Russia challenge American capabilities with new technologies and systems. Iran and North Korea threaten regional and global stability, while violent extremism remains a global menace. The National Defense Strategy calls on the Department of the Air Force as a critical component of the joint force to deter, and if deterrence fails, to defeat these threats. This fiscal year's, the 2021 budget request sets the course for the department to accomplish these aims. Specifically, the Department of the Air Force invests in future forces that allow us to connect the joint force, dominate space, generate combat power, and conduct logistics under attack. We will continue to present ready forces to combatant commanders as we defend the homeland, build strategic deterrence, and counter violent extremism. Finally, we will strengthen the foundation of our forces, our airmen and space professionals, as we develop and care for our people and their families. This budget submission shifts force design to create irreversible momentum toward achieving the mission of the National Defense Strategy while growing strong and resilient leaders and families. The top policy priority for the Department is the successful launch of the United States Space Force. The space domain is integral to the joint team's success, not just in space, but in all warfighting domains. The Department of the Air Force supports a lean, agile Space Force to preserve access to space for America and our allies while deterring and, if necessary, defeating malicious actors. The success of the United States Space Force will be measured by how well we protect freedom of access to, through, and from space. In space and air, our most important investment is in connecting the joint force. We are developing the technologies to connect every sensor, every shooter, and every echelon of command to enable seamless, joint, all-domain operations. This battle network is essential to defeating current and future threats. We are also directing pivotal resources to recruit and retain the best people our nation has to offer. We are an inclusive and diverse force and are modernizing our promotion system while investing in the professional development of airmen and space professionals. The Department is expanding ongoing efforts to support and care for families. We are tackling privatized housing and PFAS challenges. Along with our sister services, we encourage state reciprocity for occupational licensing for spouses and quality schools for our children. And we are investing in professionally designed and advised programs to reduce suicides and sexual assaults. To fund future air and space forces that are capable of defending the nation against a peer competitor, we must divest some aging legacy systems. This budget retires limited numbers of aircraft, consolidating resources to increase readiness in remaining aircraft, and invest in recapitalization and modernization. This includes investing in GPS-3 satellites with signals that are 3 times more accurate and up to 8 times more anti-jam resilient than previous generations. We thank this committee and the entire Congress for fully funding the recovery efforts to rebuild Tyndall and Offutt Air Force bases. We will seek additional support as our installations and personnel assist with the ongoing COVID-19 quarantine. Ladies and gentlemen, with your continued support, America's air and space forces stand ready. We look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General Goldfein.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, distinguished members of the committee. It's an honor to present my last budget submission for the first time with both Secretary Barbara Barrett, the 25th Secretary of the Air Force, and General Jay Raymond, the first Chief of Space Operations. These are indeed historic times. So I will defer all discussion on space matters to Chief Raymond, but I want you to know it is my top priority to make him and his new service successful. So my bottom line up front, this budget, building on the last 3, offers the most aggressive package of strategic trades we have made as a department in over 2 decades to achieve complete alignment with the National Defense Strategy and secure our nation's military superiority for the next decade. Secretary Esper's guidance for this budget build was crystal clear. Build an Air Force and a Space Force that can compete, deter, and win shoulder to shoulder with our joint teammates and our allies and partners against a nuclear peer in an era of great power competition. This budget is designed to achieve this objective, and we're asking for your support to make the tough but necessary trades we'll discuss today. In numerous war games against our best assessment of the threat in 2030 and beyond, as Secretary Barrett stated, we found that investment in 4 key areas provided the Air Force we need to prevail. First, this budget connects the joint force in ways we are not today connected in order to truly fight as a joint team. Under the leadership of our chairman, General Mark Milley, the Joint Chiefs and combatant commanders are fully engaged in developing a new doctrine of warfare called Joint All-Domain Operations. Under this new warfighting construct, the Air Force is the designated lead service to connect platforms, sensors, and weapons from all domains, all services, and our allies and partners so we can truly operate at the speed of relevance. We call it Joint All-Domain Command and Control, or JADC2 for short. And we're moving out quickly. Every 4 months, we host a demonstration and link joint capabilities that are not currently connected to advance joint all-domain operations to the next level. I look forward to describing what we've achieved to date and where we're headed during questioning. Second, we must dominate space. Chief Raymond will cover investments in this critical domain of operations. And our third area of focus is generating combat power, beginning with our nuclear enterprise. This budget moves us forward to recapitalize our two legs of the triad and the critical nuclear command and control that ties it all together. Fourth, this budget invests in a new way of approaching how we keep our joint team deployed and sustained in contested combat environments. We must assume our logistics enterprise will be under attack. But the foundation of this budget submission is the greatest treasure in our nation's arsenal, our airmen, and those who will join the Space Force. We look forward to working with this committee to ensure we keep faith with the airmen that will defend our nation and support their families entrusted to our care. As this committee is aware, the 21 top line is relatively flat from last year, well short of the 3 to 5% growth required to properly support the NDS. In a flat budget environment, if a service is to move forward, it must do two things. It must make better use of what it has by connecting all platforms, sensors, and weapons in a battlefield network, JADC2. And it must find internal savings to pay for new capabilities. So Chief Raymond and I held our own night court and identified $21 billion across the FYDP by retiring the oldest of our legacy weapon systems that are either not survivable or do not contribute significantly to the 2030 peer fight. Not one of these trades is easy. Every weapon system we are asking to retire has performed well in the current fight, but many are at the end of their service life and have no future in a nuclear peer fight. This is today's hard reality. Not surprisingly, of the services, the Air and Space Forces have the largest classified portfolio of investment. This makes the story harder to tell, since most of what we're retiring is unclassified and visible, while many of our game-changing investments are classified and therefore invisible. And we want to thank many of you for taking our classified briefing and offer it to any of you or your staff between now and endgame. When you see what we're trading for, our budget submission will make perfect sense. If we are to achieve truly meaningful gains for our nation's security through implementing the NDS in a flat budget environment, we must work together on these hard trades. Chairman, I'm honored to be the 21st Chief of Staff of the Air Force. If we go to war this year against a nuclear peer, I am 100% confident we have what we need to win. And I can say that because of decisions made by our predecessors, men like John Jumper and Mike Ryan, such as the lead time for building an air and a space force. I believe it is our job to ensure that when Air Chief 24 sits in front of this committee in 2030, side by side with Space Chief number 4, they will be able to state with equal confidence that our nation's air and space forces have what they need to win. And with your support, we can achieve this goal. Thank you, sir.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, distinguished members of the committee, it's an honor to testify before this committee this morning. This is my first appearance in front of the entire committee, and I think it underscores the significance our nation has placed in elevating space to a level commensurate with its importance to national security. Since the historic establishment of the United States Space Force on December 20th, 2019, we've been moving out with speed and focus to meet the requirements of the National Defense Strategy. As the Air Force's first, as the Space Force's first Chief of Space Operations, I am humbled by the great responsibility entrusted to me, and on behalf of the space professionals that I am privileged to lead, I would like to personally thank you for your leadership in establishing our new service. Under the strong leadership of Secretary Barrett, and I would note that the Secretary made the establishment of the United States Space Force the #1 priority for the Department of the Air Force, and shoulder to shoulder with my partner and fellow service chief, Dave Goldfein, we are establishing a Space Force that is lean, agile, and mission-focused. You have given us an opportunity to build this service to enhance the lethality of our joint force while optimizing our ability to dominate in space. I want to also, if you'll allow me to take a minute to thank Dave and Dawn Goldfein for their leadership of the United States Air Force. I've had the privilege of serving under General Goldfein's leadership for several years, and I've known him longer. I will tell you, leadership is a team sport, and there is no better team to follow than Dave and Dawn Goldfein. So, sir, thank you. For the decades, the United States has had the luxury of operating in a benign space environment, operating the world's best capabilities to fuel our American way of life and our American way of war. Today, potential adversaries have taken notice and are catching up fast. Although we remain the best in the world, our advantage is eroding as adversaries are building space capabilities for their own benefit and fielding counter space systems to negate our access to space and the advantage that that access provides to our nation and those of our allies. This budget prioritizes space. It funds it to a level of $15.4 billion, representing approximately a $900 million increase this fiscal year. Specifically, the budget funds for a strong pivot towards space superiority and the foundational elements of space situational awareness, command and control, and training infrastructure that's required. Our national defense strategy demands it, and I appreciate the support you have provided over the last couple of years, and I ask for your strong support once again. You know, it's been 73 years since the United States established a separate armed service. That was the Air Force. I've spent 35 and a half years in that service, proudly in that service. But in December, I transferred over to the Space Force, and now I'm about a little over 2 months in. We have been given an unprecedented opportunity to build a service unconstrained by past constructs and thinking. And we are taking full advantage of this occasion to do just that, with a forward-looking, innovative approach that seeks to optimize manning, flatten organizations, and streamline processes necessary to move at speed. When fully established, we may not look like other services you've become accustomed to, but we will be equally proficient at providing space forces ready and willing to protect U.S. allied interests in space while providing unequaled capability to the joint force. This is critical given the warfighting domain that we find ourselves in today. To that end, I am so proud of the professionals that I am privileged to lead. They are conducting their mission with an eager boldness that will ensure America remains the best in the world at space, and we look forward to your questions. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you all very much. I have obviously many questions, but I'll narrow it down to one because I've had the opportunity to speak with you before. There's quite a bit of discussion on the budget about in the nuclear area, General Goldfein. The NNSA budget was roughly $17.5 billion. There was concern about that, and at the last minute, there was $2.5 billion put back in and taken away from some other things, and those some other things are not happy about it. But for the moment, focusing on that $2.5 billion, can you explain to us what it is, how important it is to the overall nuclear enterprise, and if it's important, why the president's original budget didn't have it in it?
So as you know, there's a balance between NNSA that gives us the actual warheads and then the Department of Defense.
Understood.
And it's always a balancing act between the two. And as I understand, at Endgame, when they took a look at the investment that we required to get the warheads we need, balanced with the investment we're making in the enterprise for the bomb bodies, delivery mechanisms, that the department made a decision at the OSD level to put money in the NSSA account. So that's about as much detail as I understand on that.
Okay. But well, you're putting together the nuclear enterprise here, so you got the $2.5 billion. you don't got the $2.5 billion. How does that affect your ability to get our nuclear forces where you think they need to be?
So right now, the impact has been minimal on the Air Force, based on the fact that what you'll see in our budget is fully funded for our nuclear programs. So we were able to put the money that's required for the B-21, the long-range standoff, and the ground-based strategic deterrent. Those are fully funded in our program. So the 2.5 actually didn't have an impact on the Air Force.
Well, no, I understand that. I'm speaking to you as the person who's, and I also understand that NNSA is in charge of, giving you the material you need to put into all these things.
Sure.
But you are kind of overseeing to make sure that you don't just have a B-21, you actually have the nuclear missiles in it
Right.
to make it useful. So you don't have an opinion on that $2.5 billion fight?
Sir, I don't, only because it was happening at a much higher level. What we brought forward was a fully funded program for all of the portions that the Air Force is responsible for.
Understood.
One of the areas that is very similar to what you're describing is nuclear command and control, and making sure that our portion, which is about 75% of what all comes together, and maybe Chief Raymond may pitch in here because so much of what we do in nuclear command and control is actually done from space, but we also needed to make sure that that portion was fully funded.
Understood. That's all I have. I'll yield to Mr. Thornberry.
General Goldfein, you were describing what's required to keep the Air Force moving forward in a flat budget. I'd respectfully add one more thing to your list, and that is get your money on time, because you can do more if you've got a whole year to plan versus some of the other alternatives, and that makes a difference too. Let me pick up on kind of part of where the chairman was going. So the Air Force is responsible for 2 legs of the triad plus a large part of nuclear command and control. There are some people who suggest, well, it's not that big a deal if we can delay replacement of the land-based leg of the triad, or maybe manned bombers or a thing in the past. Can you just briefly describe your view on where we are with those programs that are under the Air Force responsibility, and how much slack there is or is not in the schedule and funding for those?
Yes, sir. Unfortunately, that we've actually delayed this recapitalization point where we really don't have any slop left in the schedule. The ground-based, the Minuteman missile is 44 years old. We're getting to a point where there's time components in that missile that you actually no longer have vendors that can produce those. So, and we're quite frankly, we're behind our adversaries in many ways. Russia has actually completed its triad recapitalization, and we're actually just getting started in ours. So we really have not allowed any slop in the system right now for us to be able to go forward and do anything but recapitalize all 3 legs. And I would just finish on saying that the nuclear posture review that we all went through reconfirmed the need for all 3 legs of the triad, and I think Admiral Richard confirmed that as well in his testimony early last week.
Okay. General Raymond, one of the questions involving Space Force is who's responsible for space acquisition? And I know there's a bit of a tussle maybe, or I understand there may be a bit of a tussle going on in the department and so forth. Can you just give us a few comments on space acquisition, who decides, and how you see that going forward?
That's a great question. I think one of the benefits of standing up a Space Force, near-term benefits, will be to bring some unity of effort across the department towards that end. One of the homework assignments that was in the NDAA was for us to come back to Congress with a process for how we wanted to do acquisition. We're going through that right now. In my opinion, I think there's a way to do this to, 1, keep the speed up because we have to move fast. 2, unite efforts across a group of folks that do this towards a common architecture that we're all rowing in the same direction and reduce duplication. I'm excited for the prospects. I think you expect the Space Force to deliver that to you, and we're working that hard. We've already got the team putting that together. I'm going to see the draft of that this next week, and it'll be coming to meet the timelines that Congress laid out.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Goldfein, I'm also the chair of the Aviation Subcommittee, and so we deal a lot with pilots and pilot shortages. And so I wanted to ask you about how the U.S. Air Force is thinking about pilot shortages, and as well maybe the bow wave, the idea of the recapitalization and the kind of platforms we might be flying, and where the numbers of seats in the number of rear ends in the seats meets the number of platforms that actually need them versus the transition to unmanned.
No, thanks, sir, and thanks for your leadership on this. You know, we say it from the beginning, this is a national level issue, not an Air Force level issue. The nation actually is not producing enough pilots to service military, commercial, and business aviation. From the military standpoint, as the airlines continue to hire in large numbers, we're about holding our own, I would describe right now, in terms of our pilot shortage. We're about 2,000 short. We've been about 2,000 short. That's against a denominator of about a 21,000 pilot requirement across the Air Force. We're starting to see positive trends in terms of retention, but it's too early to declare any kind of victory. Congress has been very helpful with the authorization you have given us for bonuses, but I will tell you that most pilots are not truly motivated by money. It's very important to them, but they are motivated by quality of service. And everything we're doing as an Air Force is ensuring that flying in the United States Air Force is as rich in experience as we can make it. And we're making that rich at the squadron level. So I'm seeing positive trends, but right now we're sort of holding our own.
Okay. So a couple of things that your Air Force is doing. One is on using AI on predictive maintenance to save costs, and then the digital design technology application of that to the T7. But in your testimony, especially on the T7, you talk about how it's saving money. So, given that you've had you found $21 billion in savings to reinvest, for those two examples, would we find that in the budget where the money's been saved and has been put back into something else, whether it's because of the application of a new design and manufacturing process, or because of the money you're saving on predictive maintenance?
Sir, in a flat budget with less spending power, you're not going to see that money, as much of that money in terms of increased investment. What you're going to see that is filling the holes we have in weapon system sustainment. So you talked about two areas. One, which is how do you use artificial intelligence when it comes to predictive maintenance? We have 3 weapon systems now that we're taking commercial best practices, C5 as an example, and using predictive maintenance to make sure that we decrease the amount of time in depots, be more predictive about when we need to put them in depot, and we're actually saving a lot of time and a significant amount of money. We're reflowing that back into weapon system sustainment to drive our readiness rates up. On the T7, here's to me the most exciting thing about the T7 when I went out and took a look at it. They engineered this aircraft through digital design, which is different than digital manufacturing. They actually designed it through digital means so that they were able to marry a fuselage with a wing in some number of hours with like 4 people. That's unheard of in the business of aircraft manufacture. So not only are we designing things well, we're building them more effectively and more efficiently. That's going to result in savings.
General, I had a question for you too, but why don't I ask you this, and you can, with the time left, I'll be quick, but a question for you is about space professionals and given your stand-up Space Force, how many folks are moving over, but where are your gaps in people that you need to develop to fill in those gaps?
Yeah, well, so we have so today there's one person in the United States Space Force. That's me. And so
you're doing a great job.
There's plenty of gaps.
Or he or she is doing a great job, whoever that is.
In a couple weeks, we're going to swear in number 2, and that's Chief Master Sergeant Roger Toberman. There's incredible interest in this. This May, we're going to direct commission just shy of 65 cadets from the Air Force Academy directly commissioned into the United States Space Force. We just advertised 40 positions, civilian positions, for the staff at the Pentagon. We had over 5,000 applicants for those 40 positions. There is an excitement about space in every single sector. And so where we're focusing on is not the support part. That we're going to rely for about 80% of that work. All is going to be relied upon on the Air Force. What we're doing is building a mission-focused space expertise with some related engineering, data, software, cyber that will be necessary to fight and win this fight going forward.
All right, and I'll come back to you later on the tech question. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to clarify a few comments by the chairman with respect to the NNSA budget. There really is only, and I agree with the chairman on the need for clarification for the NSA budget so that we can have a debate and hopefully a clarity, the efficiency and effectiveness of what we're spending there. We just had a hearing in the Strategic Forces Subcommittee yesterday where the Administrator Lisa Gordon-Haggerty testified. The only original budget of the President's budget is the President's budget. There are always documents that are floating around of requests for different levels. NNSA's original request by the Administrator was for the 19 plus 7, I think 19.7 that actually has moved forward in the President's budget. And I know the President was always in support of that full amount. So we would always hope that as the President puts his budget together that there is full discussion as to increase or decreases. But General Goldfein, I want to thank you for your service. I want to thank you for that you got us through sequestration, the difficulties of the effects upon readiness, and seeing the advances that our adversaries have made in both missiles and fighters and cyber and unmanned aerial systems, and the need to then fashion a force that can face that in the future. I do want to go back to the chairman's issue on the NNSA budget. I know that you're not in charge of that budget. NNSA is under DOE, not DOD, so you wouldn't have been part of putting that together. I understand your reticence there, wanting to comment on the elements in their budget. However, Admiral Richard from U.S. Stratcom Commander testified recently before us that failure to undertake the NNSA's modernization plan would be the effect of unilateral disarmament. General Goldfein, you know what the condition is of our nuclear forces and what we're facing. Do you agree with Admiral Richard?
Sir, I do.
Okay, excellent. Madam Secretary, as we go forward with Space Force, I agree with the chairman. We have to make certain that what we're doing is effective and efficient, that we don't just build new bureaucracies, that we don't duplicate things. Secretary of Defense Esper was in front of us, and I raised the issue of NASIC with him. And General Raymond was before the Strategic Forces Subcommittee, and I raised NASIC again with General Raymond. As you know, the National Air and Space Intelligence Center actively works to bring together intelligence, both from our space assets and looking at the threats that we face in the air and the space. Secretary Esper has been to NASIC. I just spoke before the McLeese Defense Program Conference, and my first question was about NASIC, and it wasn't from someone from Ohio, and it wasn't someone from Dayton, so even though this is a parochial issue, it is, I believe, an operational issue for the Air Force. Secretary Esper said that we do not want to, as we look to creating assets that are dedicated to the Space Force, break anything that works, duplicate existing missions, and we, of course, want to avoid unnecessary redundancies. When you look to the issue of a National Space Intelligence Center, like if you would comment, because there are a number of people throughout the Air Force enterprise that are as excited as General Raymond said about joining the Space Force and making certain that it's successful, but at the same time don't want the things that we currently have broken or diminished. If you could speak about that for those who are serving at NASIC, I think it would be very beneficial for them. Madam Secretary.
Member Turner, the NASIC is a national treasure. What it provides is very important to the entire Department of the Air Force, and with the support of the Secretary of Defense and the intelligence community, we would intend to continue and count upon, rely upon, and not break the expertise that is found at NASIC.
Thank you, Secretary Barrett. General Goldfein, we're all concerned about pilots and the pilot shortage, and looking to the FY21 request, there are a number of people who are concerned, obviously, that it looks like you're decreasing the number of new pilots in the process that would be in the process through funding. Could you explain that to us and give us some insights there?
Sir, actually, we've gone from about a little over 1,100 pilots that we produced in 16 to about 1,317. We're on track to produce 1,480. That's our target. And we think if we can get 1,480 a year, we're on track to doing that 24, no later then we'll be able to keep a steady state of what we need to be able to fly. Part of what's going on with the reduced numbers is a combination of grounding. This last year we had some issues, as you remember, with the T6 and the oxygen system, and so we lost a number of sorties that we're not going to be able to make up. So the numbers, we didn't hit our goal last year. So now what we're doing is trying to look at a combination of pilot training next, which is using new technology to train in a different way, but to the same or higher standard, to be able to shorten the course length and increase more pilots. When I went through,
And I'm sorry, if you could wrap up that point. The gentleman is over time. I want to get to the other members, but I don't want to interrupt you if you just wrap up.
if there's time later, I could talk about pilot training next. We're using new technology to train differently.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Garamendi.
General Goldfein, thank you for all the years. It's been a pleasure working with you, and I'm sure all of us will miss your competent work. Several things are on my mind. Just keep in mind that there's an $8 billion reserve account in the NNSA that apparently is to be used someday, somehow. So what's another $2 billion for? Good question. We should ask that question. Which brings me to an accounting issues. You're moving money back and forth within the Air Force accounts, weapons sustainment, money moving here from flight time and around OCO money moving. I'm not going to get into it, but I'm asking my staff to get into the details of your accounting system so that we can understand where the money is and for what its purpose is. So not here. It's far too much detail. General Raymond, with regard to the Space Force, good. Eventually you'll have the entire force in hand. I would ask you to keep in mind the role that the National Guard currently plays in space, not only in California at Beale Air Force Base, which is significant. How you move that in is going to be extremely important to maintain the capabilities that you presently have. I would urge you not to break it up, bring it in whole, and we can go into that in detail as I did yesterday at the hearing. The F-35. Two things about the F-35. One, the Alice system. I guess we can solve that problem by giving it a new name. Probably not, although that seems to be what would be happening here. Heads up, we're not going to back off on this. The spurs are on, and we're going to ride hard until we get this resolved. It's a readiness issue. It's also an issue for my colleague over here, Mr. Norcross. Quick comment on it, Secretary Barrett, Goldfein, either the two of you or both. Can I count on you getting this resolved?
The F-35 is of urgent importance to us. We're
How will
counting
you
on
get it resolved?
And I'll ask the chief to address that.
So I sat down with the CEO, all the CEOs, and told them point blank, I'm going to get a question in Congress. And the question is, why should we buy you more F-35s when you can't sustain the ones you have and they're too expensive to fly? And I said, I've got to have a better answer to that question. They got on it. I went down to Lockheed. I spent an entire day with them. Alice to Odin is not just a name change. We are involved in the requirements for that system. Our Kessel Run software designers and developers are deeply involved in this, and we're having a far more mature discussion about data that we need to have. But, sir, we need this committee to keep its boot on the throat of this program, along with us, to make sure that we drive these costs down, because right now it's not affordable. Here's the good news. I've seen more movement on this in the program in the last 6 months than I've seen in the last 2 years.
Well, I think Lockheed Martin's here in the audience, and they know that they're in deep trouble. And so are you. This has to be resolved. It cannot continue on. And yes, Alice is only one piece of the problem. There are the depots, and this cuts across all the departments, and it's a problem for each and every department. We'll start, since you're here. Heads up, we'll get into it in detail offline, but know that this is a major, major concern. You are moving into this joint domain issue in a very big way. You've moved a lot of assets out of the, what I would call readiness, that is here and now, at least for the next decade, moving those assets over to the 2030 period of time when most of this will come online. There are significant concerns. KC-10s, KC-35s disappearing, really? Transcom says, well, maybe not a good idea. Could you please comment on this issue? And I understand you're rethinking this part of the budget.
Sir, this is the common tension that you will always see between a combatant commander that has a near-term requirement and a service chief that's building a force to win in 2030. And so we could have the same discussion about tankers, fighters, bombers, command and control, ISR. So in the tanker business, two options, two things I want to tell you. First of all, if we go to war into a high-end fight in terms of mitigation, we have already told the combatant command and the Secretary of Defense that we would put every KC-46 into a high-end fight.
Even
we
though it
would
doesn't
not
work?
use it for day-to-day operations, but we'd use it for high-end combat operations. What we're asking for is a 3% retirement, representing 3% of the KC-135 fleet. And so we're working through that with the Secretary of Defense now, but it's a reasonable trade.
Thank you.
And you have a 25% failure rate on the,
Actually, if I could ask this question, the comment under his breath there that I think you missed was the notion that the KC-46 fundamentally doesn't work. I think that's actually an important question to address before we move on. Does it have problems, or does it fundamentally not work?
So we're having significant issues with the remote visual system. It's a hardware problem that requires a hardware fix. I sent a letter to the CEO, Mr. Calhoun. He came to see me 3 days later. We sat down. He committed to me that this is his #1 priority for getting this back on track. I've seen a different behavior from that company since he's taken over. We're on final, so I want to be careful about negotiations, but we think we have a good fix.
Of the many issues in your portfolio, getting a clear picture as to how we get the KC-46 to actually function like it's supposed to is a pretty big one. So we'll definitely, I know Mr. Norcross will definitely be following up with you on that as well. Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all three of you for your contribution to our national defense, and General Goldfein, you will be missed. My first question is for Secretary Barrett and General Raymond. It has been a pleasure working with both of you throughout the stand-up of Space Command and the creation of Space Force. As you know already, I believe that Colorado Springs is the best option for that permanent location. We've had this conversation a time or two, actually more than that, based on many factors ranging from location, civilian and military workforce, existing infrastructure and capabilities, and quality of life for service members and their families, but I'm not going to go into that today. When it comes, though, to the Guard and Reserve personnel, one of the 4 space wings which are in Colorado is a Air Reserve component of the Air Force. And there are also 630 National Guardsmen conducting space missions in our state. The synergy that we see between active duty and reserve component in space operations multiplies the capacity of the force, saves money, and retains talent. Now, I'm aware that there's a proposal to continue to study the role of the reserve component as it relates to the Space Force, but I believe this delay would create a gap in continuity for the space operators currently in the National Guard and jeopardizes the readiness of these unit-trained and equipped formations. So my question on this, is there anything holding back the establishment of a Space National Guard in this coming year?
We are very much, we cannot go to war, we cannot do our jobs without the Guard and Reserve. They're very much valued partners in the process. The Space Guard and Reserve, we're going to spend a little time looking at to incorporate that workforce in a way that we might be building a new design, a new paradigm for how that's done. The Chief has given a great deal of thought to it, and I'd invite his comments.
Yeah, Congressman Rogers, I agree with everything he said. We are reliant on the Guard and Reserve today. The 310th Space Wing at Schriever's, the wing you were talking about, there's about 1,400 guardsmen between the Army and the Air Force that provide space capabilities as well. We rely on them today, and we're going to need that in the future. We've been directed by law to do a review of this. And so we're going to follow the law. The National Defense Authorization Act of 20 tells us to do this review. We're going to do this review. We have an opportunity to look at how would we do this, and are there more efficient ways to do it for a service that's going to be about 16,000 people that's custom built for this domain. So we're going to do that. We'll meet the requirements of the law, but I will assure you that there is going to be no lapse in capability that is provided today. The Guard and Reserve can fully support what we're doing today as they are today. We're going to move out diligently with speed to answer Congress with the direction that we were given in law.
Okay, thank you both for that answer. And General Raymond, as best as you can in an open setting, can you share with us some of the characteristics a permanent National Security Space Command and Control Center needs to have to successfully fight and win wars that extend into space?
We have two really successful C2 centers today. One is in Schriever Air Force Base, the National Space Defense Center. One's at Colorado Springs. You have to have the ability to ingest data. You have to have the right expertise. You have to have relationships and connections with our allied partners. You have to be able to communicate broadly with all those that you have to communicate with, including those that are forward in theater. Those are some top-level items that I'd put at the top of the list.
Okay, thank you. And then my last question, General Raymond. I know you had a space warfighting doctrine conference at Peterson Air Force Base in January to coordinate and move forward with writing the document that will dictate how our joint force will fight wars that extend into space. And I believe it's accurate to say that your work, that product, will be used to determine the finalized force organization and equipment requirements for our space warfighters. So where are we at? What is the status report on writing the Department of Defense's space warfighting doctrine? And when do you think this will be finished, and how is it coming along?
Thank you for the question. We've had space doctrine before. It's doctrine that was built largely for a benign domain. That's not good enough today. And if when on 20 December, when the U.S. Space Force was stood up, one of the fundamental things, in my opinion, that an independent service has to do, it's got to develop its own people, and it has to develop its own doctrine. And so we pulled the team together. We put a first draft of what we call a capstone document. That will continue to get further reviewed here over the next couple months, and then we look forward to publishing that. And then there'll be several series levels of doctrine, including joint doctrine in my U.S. Space Command hat that will also follow.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate your service. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Lamborn. Chair now recognizes Representative Norcross for 5 minutes.
Thank you. First of all, General Goffin, thanks you so much for your service over years, and we particularly appreciate your frankness when you address so many of our tough questions. But I want to follow up on the question of the KC-46s.
Representative Norcross, could you pull a microphone really close to your mouth there? Thanks a lot.
The KC-46s. We're retiring some of the 135s at a little bit more of accelerated pace than we expected, and along with KC-10s. But as said, and you mentioned it earlier, in a high-end fight, we could use the 46s. Describe to us what a high-end fight looks like.
Sir, if we would go to a high-end contingency fight, either a peer fight or one where the Secretary of Defense asked me whether in high-end combat operations, whether I would be comfortable using the KC-46, I would take that risk. We've already done the operational analysis, and we would do that. We will not take that risk during day-to-day operations. And it has to do, quite frankly, with the remote visual system that very quickly, the last 10 feet, when the boom operator is trying to plug the receiver, the system was not designed well in terms of that final focus. So we're having more out of contacts around the airplane. I would take that risk in combat. I would not take that risk in day-to-day operations.
That describes it. The stiffness of the boom is only with the A-10, which may or may not be part of that. Just want to switch over to the modernization, talking about the ISR. There's not a combatant commander that we have a discussion with. There's virtually nobody we deal with day-to-day doesn't need more. Yet it appears that we're going to cut this high and dry, and particularly the notable is the Global Hawk Block 20 and 30. Would you walk us through that decision-making? Because it appears we're going to have a real lull here.
Yes, sir. There's no better example I can give you of how when we connect sensors and shooters and weapons together in a networked approach, we actually bring up capability and capacity because we're making use of those that are not connected today. So what I can't describe for you in an open hearing, and I'd love to do in a closed session, is where we're going on the classified side in terms of bringing survivable capability together. that offsets some of what we're trying to take down in those that are not survivable. But when you tie them together and you get the sensors actually comparing and fusing information, you actually increase your capacity of ISR.
We understand. We were just out at Palmdale to see some of what we're doing. But for that 4-year period, or is what they're calling a bathtub effect, is we're going down to zero and producing those new ones. What you just described to us is going to take place of those new planes that we would have instead of those?
Not one for one, but there is absolutely a replacement there. But there's also a factor that we have to think about, which is, you know, everything we produce in all the services is a standalone operating computer and sensor. And when we can tie those computers, think about, you know, anything that rolls, submerges,
Sure.
floats, flies, or orbits is a sensor. When we can actually fuse and make use of that information and not do it independently, you actually get a much better picture with greater fidelity earlier in the fight than if you just operate on a standalone basis. And that's why, as we move from platforms to networks, we actually increase our capability.
So we would expect to hear from our commanders that their view is going to change in asking for this. So that will be a cultural change we'll have to deal with. For my remaining time, I yield to Mr. Crow.
Thank you, Mr. Norcross. Thank you to all of you for your testimony today. Secretary Barrett and General Raymond, I've appreciated your discussions on Space Force. As you know, I represent Buckley Air Force Base in Aurora, which is about to become Buckley Space Base next month. Could you provide a quick update for us on the timing of the basing discussion for U.S. Space Command and the criteria being used? And I affiliate with Mr. Lamborn's comments on the importance of Colorado. Of course, I think Buckley is just slightly better than Colorado Springs on the basing.
Well, we're all very excited about the future there. With the stand-up of the Space Force, much of what had been operating in Colorado is moving to Washington, or there will be some that will move to Washington. As we redesign that system, we are going to reopen the process and put forward criteria in detail and invite all who think they have a good shot at it to come and represent their communities for that possible basing choice.
And when will that reopening occur?
It'll be this spring, it'll be announced.
Thank you.
So the chief may have further to add.
Thank you. Actually, we're out of time at the moment. So, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here today. And I especially appreciate your service. I am the son of, he's a late veteran of the 14th Air Force. He cherished his service with the people of India and China. And that was always meaningful to me. And then growing up in the holy city of Charleston, South Carolina, we appreciate the Charleston Air Force Base and the capabilities, the C-17s, everything there. Additionally, I'm the grateful uncle of a member of the Air Force, a Citadel graduate, so obviously a very bright fellow. So thank you for being here. And Secretary Barrett, F-35 aircraft provide peace through strength. There are 11 companies in South Carolina who provide the equipment for the F-35. We're grateful that the Marine Corps Air Station Beaufort is home to F-35 pilot training and will eventually have up to 90 F-35B aircraft, and the people of Beaufort County love the sound of freedom. We would gladly welcome also F-35s at McEntire Joint Air Base and Shore Air Force Base. The Air Force 2021 unfunded priority list requests an additional 12 F-35s. And Madam Secretary, fifth generation strike aircraft capability is a top priority of the Air Force. What can be done to promote 60 F-35As in your budget?
Mr. Wilson, we'd be delighted to have those additional aircraft, of course, but we have to live within the budget proposal put forward, and we, of course, will comply beyond that. And I would invite the chief to add to that.
Sir, we ended the last discussion on F-35 on a bit of a negative tone, talking about sustainment. I think it's important for me also to tell you on the record what I think of it operationally. It is performing brilliantly. My fellow air chief, the Israeli air chief, called me and said, "Hey, Dave," he goes, "you know, I'm not integrating the F-35 into the Israeli Air Force. I'm integrating the Israeli Air Force into the F-35. I can't give you a better statement of what 5th Gen is all about. This one's a game changer. It's brilliant in its performance operationally. We just got to work on the sustainment piece.
And General, thank you so much for pointing that out. And indeed, to work with our ally Israel and provide peace through strength, you're doing that. So thank you. And General Goldfein, South Carolina is pleased to have the 20th Fighter Wing at Shaw Air Force Base and the 169th Fighter Wing at McEntire Joint Air Base. We know that the Air Force has had success in growing its size of the maintenance community, although not at the desired 80% mark. I'm thankful the F-16 mission-capable rates are improving. What is the plan and timeline to improve the mission readiness for F-16s to meet or surpass the 80% goal?
Well, with the support of this committee, sir, and the money that we've had since 18, we were in a downward spiral. We've been able to get upwards of 13% overall readiness rates and 34% improvement in our pacing units. The pacing units are those units we've identified that will go first into a China or Russia fight. And so we've been able to improve now just in that short period of time. The F-16 is on that track, but I will tell you that we've got some significant modifications that we're doing that are going to require us to put the F-16s through depot, and that's going to lower our overall mission-capable rate, but we mitigate that as we get it back out of depot at a higher level of capability.
Thank you very much, General. And General Raymond, again, you're a person of history, now to be the first person to be the leader of space operations. Congratulations. One of the major focuses of Space Force is ensuring that space systems can be developed and acquired at the speed of innovation. What a challenge. What are your perspectives on how to fix the system space unique acquisition challenges?
Thanks for that question. I think it's one of the fundamental tenets of the National Defense Authorization Act, the reason for the Space Force. I think we have to go at speed. Our adversaries are going fast, and we need to go faster. I think it begins with requirements. You have to streamline requirements. I think it begins with having an architecture that everybody agrees to, and that's why when the law said that the Space Force will be responsible for the architectures of the national security space architectures, I think that's really important to get everybody rowing in the same direction. I think software, to go back to Mr. Larson's question, we are already designing how we want to do software in this force to be able to go fast, to be more software-based rather than hardware-based.
And America is grateful for each of your service. Thank you so much for what you do, protecting American families. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary Barrett, what are your thoughts about the right mix of 5th generation and 4th generation aircraft?
Well, we're going to do well to have the low observability that 5th generation allows, but there's a good role also for the 4th generation, and we're going to continue to see that as a balance and as a correct mix. I'd invite the Chief of Air Force to add to that.
So right now we're about 2040. We think by about 2030 we'll be right in the 50-50. About 2040 time frame, we're projected to be at about 60-40. That's about the right target, I think, going forward.
So you'd say a good mix then?
A good mix, and I will tell you, at some point in the future, we're going to be talking about the same thing in a 5th, 6th gen mix.
Right. And so I agree with that. But so kind of considering what you guys just said, if we need proven capable aircraft, why is the Air Force announcing the intent to retire 44 A-10 Warthogs without giving us more details?
The A-10 story, I'll tell you that, as I said yesterday in the SAS, you know, Senator McSally and many others have done a great job really saving the A-10. So the A-10 is going to fly well through the 2030s. We're putting almost $1 billion into the A-10, updating its wings, updating its avionics, updating its radios. There is no better platform for close air support, and we're going to keep that into the 2030s.
So then, okay, I get what you're saying, Joe, and so that's why I'm confused. So why we're planning to retire then if we're putting this much investment in them? The 44.
Because we're fleet managing, sir, across the fleet. KC-135s, KC-10s, Global Hawks, A-10s, right? We're taking the oldest airframes that are unaffordable to keep flying, and then putting that money and that manpower back in the existing system and buying new technology.
But also just wanted to point out that we have been very clear, as in Congress, specifically the House Armed Services Committee through the 2017 NDAA, that there is not to be any reduction of the A-10 until there is a study between the F-35 and the A-10. And that study is coming out when?
So that study is complete. I've talked to the director of OT&E. It's actually, he's prepared to offer that as an interim report, but he's right now planning on delivering that in September with the full IoT&E report on the F-35.
But the 2017 NDA says that you do not do any movement, any decision on the A-10 until you come and deliver that report. Right now, you've made a decision without delivering us the report. So, in my opinion, you're in violation of the 2017 NDA. Is that not, what else should I take from that?
Well, sir, we had this discussion yesterday as well with the SASC. You know, when we looked through it and looked at the language, given that we were going to give you the report on the first month of the fiscal year and the timing that is laid out in the law, there is actual time between the end of the FYDP to conclude this. But I will tell you, we understand the law and we will follow it.
Okay. Now, I understand that there has been a change in the plan from the first initiation or the first release of the plan. And yesterday, when you were talking on the Senate side, that you guys have a new plan for the A-10. So what is the details of this new plan?
So the only plan we have right now is the one that's in the president budget. I'd be happy to get with you offline on this dialogue that we're having.
Great. I do want to say for the record, Mr. Chairman, that this is very, very discouraging, though, and also just to my fellow witnesses in front, that we are moving in this direction after we have been very clear as Congress, as the Armed Services Committee, certainly in a bipartisan manner. I've been in support of the A-10 Warthog when when the Obama administration tried to get rid of it. I've been here fighting when the Trump administration got rid of it, not just because it's based in Arizona, because I do think it's a capable fighting platform, and it basically saved my ass in Operation Matador in Al Qaim. You know, and as much as I love F-35, I don't want to be using a $1 billion platform to support infantrymen. That's not smart, and it's just not a smart use of our money. And going into the future, the Air Force may only want to fight in the air or in the space domain, but no matter what, there will always be infantrymen, and they'll always need close air combat support. And whatever platforms are out there right now, the best one, the cheapest one, the strongest one, certainly if something ever happens, especially in Russia, with Russia surging into the Eastern European theater, is still the A-10. So I make sure, I look forward to that report, but I think we need to be very, very clear that this Congress, the Senate, has said that until we see something that's a better replacement to the A-10, that A-10 is not going anywhere. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Sir, can I?
Sorry, Budget.
1 minute?
Yes.
Sir,
Quickly, sorry.
Sir, if I just offer that, number one, we're going to put whatever we need to support soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines on the ground, whatever it takes, regardless of the cost. You're looking at a guy who was shot down in combat, got up the next night, went and flew, and I flew close air support. Let there be no mistake on the commitment of the United States Air Force. We fly to the sound of the guns, and we support everybody on the ground, or we die trying.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased to see the Air Force here in its new structure. It's great for our nation. I know this is your first NDA, Secretary Barrett. You know I'm a big fan of yours, and General Raymond knows how I feel. But I want, for the record, to thank General Goldfein for his many years of service. He is an incredibly respected general officer and has done an admirable job. And on behalf of a thankful nation, I want to say for the record, I appreciate you. General Goldfein, the Space Force has begun a significant investment in OPIR architecture to replace SBIRS. Can you tell me what that's going to look like and if we're going to be able to meet the 2025 timetable?
I think you meant that for me.
Did I not say General Raymond?
Yeah, okay.
I'm sorry, I might not have.
No. This is a critical capability for our nation. It provides the unblinking eye for detecting against missiles that are coming into our country. Interestingly, there is also the replacement for the system that provided warning to our troops in Iraq when Iran launched missiles.
But what I'm after is, how's it going to look different than SBIRS?
Yeah, so what this program does, it's a more, and I can go into much more details in a closed hearing, but it is a more defendable capability than SBIRS. And when we made that trade a couple years ago to shift from SBIRS 7.8 to next generation OPIR, it was because of that defendability. It includes a geo segment, a polar segment. It includes the ground architecture as well. And with the support of this committee, the 804 authorities we had, we're, I think, 18 months, we got an 18 months head start on prototyping, and we just completed some hardware integration testing that was 4 years ahead of its predecessor SIBRs.
So you're confident we're going to make
I'm
2025?
confident we're going to make 2025, and we're fully funded with this funding to do that.
Okay, you recently signed out a fighting SATCOM strategy.
That's right.
Tell me what that is.
Yes, sir, I'll be happy to. It's really important. Our adversaries are developing capabilities or have capabilities that can jam satellite communications. We have to be able to fight in a contested domain. When you travel overseas and you turn your iPhone on, it links up to whatever network that you go to. Last year's NDA provided me the authority to procure commercial SATCOM, and we think there's a great opportunity here working with the commercial industry to bring commercial SATCOM and military SATCOM closer together and provide a resilient hybrid network that says if a warfighter is on this satellite and it gets jammed or loses contact for whatever reason, it can automatically switch over to another satellite, whether it's commercial or military. And that's the gist of that strategy.
Great. General Goldfein, the Air Force recently realigned $4.1 billion across the FYDP. That according to the Air Force budget documents are being used to invest in 4 broad categories: connect the joint force, dominate space, generate combat power, and conduct logistics under attack. Would you please elaborate on the specific types of investments being made with this budget request and address the priority areas?
Yes, sir, and Chief Raymond talked to the space piece. Let me just focus on the connecting the joint force. We're on path to do every 4 months, we connect portions of the joint team that is not currently connected through the digital engineering and common data architecture, and then we solve problems. So we're all going, all the Joint Chiefs, we're all headed to Nellis Air Force Base in April. And we have 3 supported commanders that we're going to produce all domain options for them by connecting capabilities. This is going to be a live fly exercise. We're going to have ships off the Gulf. We're going to have Marines at Yuma. We're going to have Army at White Sands Missile Range. We're going to be flying at Nellis. And we're going to do this joint all-domain command and control demonstration to pull this all together in a homeland defense scenario. We learn every time we do it. A year ago, we were talking about this, and it was mostly aspirational lightning bolts on PowerPoint charts. There was not a lot behind it. Today, we're not talking about cloud architecture. We have one. We contracted it, it's up and operating, and all the services are connected to it. We're not talking about common data architecture. We actually have it up and running. So what you're seeing is about $2.5 billion that we put forward to connect this joint team. And I'll end with, of all the things that we're doing, this has the most promise of producing a joint team that can win in 2030.
Thank you.
I would, if I could pile onto that for 2 seconds as well. This is absolutely critical for space. We have to operate at great distances at speed. And the work that we've been doing in what we used to call Enterprise Space Battle Management C2 is lashed into that joint all-domain C2 and is providing a lot of the data architecture that it's using.
Great. I would just close by pointing out we're going to have a new seal on the wall when y'all got one.
Yes, sir. I'll deliver it and we'll hang it together.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Everybody seems very concerned about that. There's a balance issue because we have 3 on one side, 3 on the other. So we're gonna have to figure out the logistics of that. But Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. Again, it's a good opportunity to talk the other day, and appreciate you coming by. I know the issue of the remote visual system has been brought up by other members. I'm not going to belabor the point. I just want to, again, emphasize that as we get closer to markup and the Sea Power and Projection Forces Subcommittee, we have to make a decision about building more planes that we know are going to have to be fairly significantly retrofitted. So to the extent that, this comes to a conclusion, in terms of what that retrofit looks like. Frankly, it would, I think, just make for common sense budgeting so that we know, what we're paying for. And again, we had a good discussion on that, and I hope, again, just to, see that dovetail as we get closer to the timeline for decisions here. The other question I just want to touch on is the Air National Guard C-130s. The Connecticut Air Guard just returned from Afghanistan. They did eye-watering work in terms of just the tonnage and personnel that they transported in that part of the world. They're doing a good job. And but another issue that we've had to kind of wrestle with on the subcommittee over the last 3 or 4 years is modernization of the C-130s. The propeller issue in particular, the Air Force had to ground obviously some C-130s back in 2019. The Navy had a catastrophe because of defective propellers. a lot of us think that the MP2000 is a solution that just will, eliminate the safety issue that we know, certainly had that impact with the Navy situation. Maybe just talk about that a little bit in terms of, another decision that the subcommittee is going to have to wrestle with very soon.
No, thanks, sir. And I echo your comments on the Guard. We couldn't fight without the Guard. So particularly on the propeller, so we have replaced all the pre-1971 C-130H propellers with the MP2000, which I've been down to the depot. It's a great propeller. We've modified our depot and our maintenance procedures on the post-1971s to mitigate safety concerns. So we're not looking through the safety lens. I will tell you, though, we're in ongoing discussions on how, if there's more money, we could actually take that new propeller and make it more broad across the fleet. So again, thanks to your constituents who produced a great product.
Well, again, we'll look forward to continuing that conversation. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. General Goldfein, thank you for your service and your engagement with this committee. It's been very helpful particularly for us younger members. I was wondering, in 2018, we authorized via the NDA then a series of studies on the Air Force's future aircraft inventory. One of those was conducted by CSBA, and we now have that report, a new CSBA report, coming out of that requirement that found that, quote, the current CAF predominantly consists of aging, non-stealth aircraft that are not suitable for operations in contested and highly contested threat environments. This force structure is largely the result of decisions to cancel or prematurely truncate CAF modernization initiatives to develop and procure new weapon systems for high-end operations against modern IADs, such as the F-22 and B-2 programs. In addition to program cost, the primary justification for these decisions was based on a belief that low observable aircraft would not be needed in significant numbers to support contingency operations against regional aggressors like Iraq or North Korea. Although reasonable in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, this assumption is no longer valid. I know that's a mouthful, but do you agree with that CSBA assessment?
Sir, I would say that here's my recollection, having been, and many in this room perhaps were there when the decision was made to cancel and stop the F-22. At that time, the decision was made to reflow that money into accelerating the F-35. If we had just completed the program of record when that decision was made, we would have 1,000 F-35As on the ramp today. We didn't get there. So therefore, what we have is a fleet that has continued to age out as we've flown it downrange. But I would not align with any assessment that says that low observability is not critical for the future.
Well, what lessons would you then draw or suggest to future planners who may be tempted to cut modernization?
For sure, for the Air Force, I mean, we're probably one of your more technical of services. So again, when you look into, and we can bring, and I'd love to sit down with each of you in the classified setting, when we bring you what we're investing in terms of modernization and the game-changing technology that we're bringing forward, you'll see and understand why we're making the trades we are with some of the older legacy platforms. An Air Force that doesn't modernize doesn't win.
What do you say to those? I mean, you look at the geography of Indo-PACOM, which I think we would all agree is now the priority theater if you follow the logic of the National Defense Strategy. The geography is challenging. The ranges are long. There's questions about the A2AD environment. There's questions about access to allied airfields as well. What do you say to those who would suggest we should, given that geography, be emphasizing our B-21 program, for example, and seek to grow it, perhaps also correspondingly pull back on tactical aircraft procurement?
Sir, I jokingly tell my slide builders that if I see one more slide with a big red dome over China, I'm going to execute choke con on the slide builder. China can't put a block of wood red dome over itself. It can put a block of Swiss cheese. And my job is to know where the hole's in and get in and hold targets at risk at the time and place of the commander-in-chief's choosing. And one of the weapon systems that does that is the B-21.
Point being that, you know, A2AD poses challenges, but it's not an impenetrable wall.
Never.
the Air Force has committed to standoff hypersonic weapons, but what are our plans for stand-in hypersonic weapons associated with the F-35A?
So you may know that we down-selected from 2 hypersonic programs to 1.
This was Arrow and
Axel.
Axel, yeah.
And we did that based on the fact that a combination of funding, we had gotten a lot of benefit out of the competition while it went on. The more flexible of the 2 was the Arrow program. So now we're pushing full forward on that. But I'll tell you that the service secretaries signed an agreement to ensure that we take the best of each service when it comes to hypersonic technology, under the leadership, quite frankly, of Dr. Mike Griffin, who's really steeped in this technologically, to make sure that the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, that we're all bringing our best technology in our labs forward and making this complementary as we go forward.
Appreciate that. I am running out of time, so General Raymond, all of my detailed questions about the future of Space Force uniforms will have to wait until the next hearing.
I'll be happy to come by and see you too.
Appreciate that very much. I yield.
Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Madam Secretary and generals for being here. General Goldfein, I want to thank you for your service. Had the privilege of receiving testimony from you in this hearing, being in the presence of your presence at a variety of forums, and you're not only a fantastic leader, but a real thought leader. And I hope that as you take off your uniform, you don't venture too far from the national security conversation that's happening in this country. I'm also very excited that your successor, who's been nominated by the President, I'm confident will be confirmed by the Senate, General Charles Brown, the first African-American Chief of Staff, not only for the Air Force, but of any service component. So I'm looking forward to working with him as we ensure that the United States has the air power necessary to counter our adversaries. I wanted to talk about the shortfall in the number of pilots that impacts readiness, but take a more narrow approach. In your joint statement, you say that diverse, resilient, and ready airmen and space professionals are the bedrock of the department's readiness and lethality. You've got a pilot shortfall, and you've got a problem. You're lacking diversity and inclusion among your aviators. In April 3rd of 1939, this Congress created and funded the program that today we know as the Tuskegee Airmen. There were 1,000 pilots in that program. Granted, the corps of pilots was much larger as we were gearing up for World War II, but it represented 0.5%, small percentage of the pilots. Today, there are only 47 African Americans who fly fixed wing in the Air Force. That's 1.5%. And I don't have the numbers for women, but it's as disturbingly low. I know that you're doing a number of things to address that. But the question is, what can we do 81 years later as a Congress to enable you to achieve the diversity, not just for the sake of the diversity, but to enable you and our nation to meet the readiness needs and the challenges that are faced by a shortfall in the pilots that we have in uniform. Can you please address that for me?
Well, as a pilot and someone who worked ardently to get the 1948 law that prohibited women from flying fighters, to get that law changed in 1992 and the policies changed in 1993, it is a topic that matters a great deal to me. And as the secretary who recommended C.Q. Brown's appointment, I feel strongly that we need to occupy the talent in whatever package that talent is presented. I've been a friend of a number of Tuskegee Airmen over the decades and decades, and was there when the president pinned on the general star on now General McGee, a Tuskegee Airman who celebrated his 100th birthday not so long ago. The first thing we have to do is recognize there's a problem, and the quantification of that problem is what the RAND report recently identified for us. And then I think one of the things that will help us is the recent attention brought to military service of when the Space Force was stood up. There's a new excitement about being a part of the military service. People want to be a part of the Air Force and Space Force as a result of that. I would invite my colleagues both to speak to it as well, or I welcome meeting with you further.
I'll take that for the record, because let me just point out that this is what the report found, and we cannot be afraid of this. We have to take it head on. It says that minorities and women, the report found that barriers to minorities and women included racist and sexist comments from simulation instructors, race and gender stereotyping, and a contending with the prevailing culture. This was based on focus groups from not only students, but instructors and leaders. We've got a culture problem in the Air Force, and I expressed this last week in the Navy. So I just implore you to take this on and ask Congress for your help. And in the last 20 seconds I have, let me make a pitch for this. I visited Dover Air Force Base. They're right next door to Delaware State University, an historically black college and university. They have an aviation program there. Their ROTC affiliation, unfortunately, is an hour drive away from Delaware State. Let's find flexibility to establish an ROTC unit right there at Delaware State University so they can team up with Dover and help address this need. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Secretary of the Air Force. You're doing a great job stepping in. We applaud what you're doing. Congratulations to General Raymond. You've come a long way since you and I inspected Hurlburt and Nellis Air Force Base as colonels. But congratulations.
You've come a long way, too.
Thank you. And General Goldfein, congratulations on a great job. I personally believe you will always be known as one of the greats in our Air Force, and I just want to applaud the great work you've done. Madam Secretary, I wanted to get your assessment. Do we have an appropriate budget that can field the B-21 and the GBSD on time? Are we on track to do that?
We have the budget to do that. We have to be ever vigilant to make sure that it continues and that we keep those productions going.
Thank you. I think fielding a triad and recapitalizing all three parts of that is priority number one. It'd be my first top priority, and I hope out of this committee. Do we have a better name for GBSD for two? I mean, we got to work on something. I have to practice this to get that acronym right.
We're in, I think, total agreement that it fails on the moniker test, but the mission is the right mission.
Okay, thank you. And both to our chiefs here, 3 years ago when I came in, our readiness levels was, I think it was an emergency. I'll just give you one example. In the Army, we had 58 combat brigades. Only 3 could deploy or fight tonight. Could you both give me some evidence with 3 years of good budgets that we've turned this readiness level, at least pointed the right way and making progress? General Goldfein.
Sir, I'll just tell you that when we came out of the downward spiral in 18 and really just stopped the bleeding, since that time, with your help, we've had 13% increase in readiness and mission capable rates overall, and about 34% increase in our pacing units, which are those that we identify to go into in the first opening days of a China-Russia campaign. Probably it's one of the more exciting parts that we've been able to do is we're getting back in the air again. We're back to the 19 to 20 hours, 21 hours per month that perhaps you and I grew up with, that we were unable to get to even close. Pilots came into the Air Force to fly. Maintainers came in to maintain. Air traffic controllers came to control. If they don't think that we're serious about readiness, they're going to vote with their feet. You want to find the highest morale in the United States Air Force, you go find the highest levels of readiness.
Totally agree.
I would just add, in the space community, our readiness levels were always relatively high, but we were measuring it off of a benign domain without a threat. And so where we have really focused our efforts is to train our operators to operate in a contested environment, procure the training infrastructure required to be able to do that, redo all of the metrics, if you will, that we grade ourselves off of to add that contested nature in so we can be prepared to provide the space capabilities our nation needs.
Thank you. And one last question. I want to go into the electronic warfare realm. I was 30 years in that field, and as I think we would agree, in the 90s we sort of walked away from that, and it's the electronic magnetic spectrum is a physical finite domain. and the other side wants to deny that for our radios, talking to our satellites, using our radars. I think we fell behind. And I heard a great briefing last Friday from the Joint Staff. I've also heard from our Air Force, One Star. I think we're making great strides, but I want to get your sense, General Goldfein. If we turn the corner, are we doing the right things? What else can we do to help?
Sir, that muscle atrophied in 19 years of fight in a specific kind of campaign. So here's 3 things that we're doing to get that muscle, get back in the gym. First was to stood up the 16th Air Force, the first numbered Air Force focused on information warfare, the combination of cyber, ISR, electronic warfare, and information operations under one of our most brilliant operational commanders who just came out of Cyber Command to lead that. Second, we combined our A2 and our A6, traditionally intelligence and communications cyber, into an A26, aligned our phone book with the Navy that has an N26, and now we're focused on intelligence and cyber operations. And in the 21 budget, you will see that we're setting up a spectrum warfare wing, the first one of its kind, that will focus on nothing but electronic warfare. So we're back in the gym.
On the space side, in my U.S. Space Command hat, I'm responsible for protecting and defending space. That requires protecting and defending that spectrum as well. We just stood up on the Space Force side a space electronic warfare group as well.
That's fantastic. What I've heard last Friday, and I've also heard from General Gaideka, if I'm saying his name right, is we're finally at the spot where I think I'm starting to feel comfortable that we're doing the right stuff. So I appreciate the hard work. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Sherrill.
Thank you. Thank you, General Goldfein, for your service, your reputation, and precedes you. And thank you, Secretary Barrett and General Raymond, for joining us today. General Raymond, I've heard a lot about the Space Force uniforms as well. You look remarkably like an Air Force officer, so we'll see. It must be my untrained eye.
We're working it. I'll come back and model.
We're looking forward to it. So over the past week and a half, this committee has heard from the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as well as service leadership. And at every hearing, including this one, members have expressed our concern about this administration and this department's willingness to subvert the judgment of Congress in favor of their own judgment through reprogramming action. I am personally deeply concerned that the way this Department of Defense is using its reprogramming authority damages the trust between this committee and our DoD. And so in the Air Force example, what I'm concerned about particularly is the F-35 program. General Goldfein, you testified just last year that the Air Force needs to procure 60 aircraft per year to modernize the tactical fleet, meet the optimal production rates, and mitigate possible gaps. Do you still feel that way, sir?
Yes, ma'am, but I would say that in terms of total fighter force, we need 72 a year, and I'm on record for that.
So despite believing you need 72 a year, you requested funding for 48 F-35s, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. Flat budget, less buying power, that's the result.
But you would not say that the 12 unfunded F-35s were simply in excess of your current programmatic need or simply a congressional special interest item?
No, ma'am. What was taken for the wall on the F-35 was what we call advanced long lead procurement items. What we do is to reduce the amount of time to bring the aircraft. There's certain items that we buy the year prior so that those parts are actually on the line when the airplane starts coming through. What they diverted was those long lead items, so it actually doesn't have an impact on the total number of aircraft we buy. It has an impact on the lead items for the next year.
So what we do here in Congress is we look ahead to what we think our future modernization needs are, and we fund them at appropriate levels to meet the needs of our service fleet. So you said earlier that, quote, you know, when looking at the Alice problems, why should we buy you? Congress might say, why should we buy you F-35s if you haven't fixed those problems? A broader question is, why should we buy you F-35s when you're reprogramming the money we've already sent you for F-35s?
No, ma'am, it's a good question. You know, the Joint Chiefs were asked, the chairman specifically, about the question we were asked was, does the reprogramming have a immediate strategic impact on our ability to defend the nation? And so the answer that the chairman gave back was, you know, for the amount of money that was reprogrammed, no, it doesn't. It does have an impact, absolutely.
And I think as we look towards the new National Defense Strategy, at the challenges that we are all going to face in the future, at the challenges of modernizing our fleet, we are balancing very strategically here in Congress the needs, the current needs of our DoD, and then the future needs as we see them. And it is very difficult for us to have any confidence that when we make those choices and we fund certain programs, that now our DoD is going to put that money towards the programs we have in fact directed them towards. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last week, I asked Secretary Esper about the Space Force's opportunity to improve traditional federal acquisition regulations. In response to my question, Secretary Esper stated that, quote, "Our biggest challenge is culture. We have to change our culture so it's less risk averse and more willing to take bets on the small guys," end quote. General Raymond, what are your perspectives on how to develop a culture within the Space Force that is willing to accept risk on startups and the small guys, as the Secretary referred to them?
Yeah, so we're a startup company ourselves. And so we want to build this in a way that capitalizes on that. We've done a lot of work here over the last couple of years with the Space and Missile Systems Center out in Los Angeles to expand the number of non-traditional companies that are in our business. We've developed open standards so non-traditional companies can innovate to those standards. We've stood up a Space Rapid Capabilities Office modeled after the Air Force Rapid Capabilities Office to not have to fight the bureaucracy, to have direct access to the two chiefs sitting at this table and under the leadership of our secretary. And I think the other thing is we have delegated authority for programs down to a lower level. It used to all be held up at a 3-star level. And if you are risk averse, if you grew up risk averse and all of a sudden you're unleashed, it takes a while to feel unleashed and feel empowered. And we've been working that for the last couple of years.
Appreciate that. Secretary Barrett, last month, I and other members of the Future of Defense Task Force visited the Air Force Artificial Intelligence Accelerator at MIT, as well as Kessel Run in Boston. These organizations, along with AFWorks, have been aggressive at engaging across the national security innovation base outside of traditional defense contractors and bringing commercial and academic best practices and new ideas into the defense ecosystem. I wonder, are you seeing the efforts of AFWorks and similar organizations disrupt the acquisition and requirements workforce, and what more can we do to sustain and scale those efforts?
Thanks for your support of those. It has really been transformational. Already, well, just last week, we were judges on a Spark where internal to the Air Force, people came forward with ideas of inventions they had or better ways of doing things, creative solutions to concerns. So there is the pitch day that is bringing new small companies forward, and instead of the laborious process that they associate with the defense contracting, they were able to make their pitch, and if persuasive, leave that day with a contract with the Defense Department. It's really disruptive to the way it has been done. It creates a great enthusiasm by small companies and on the pitch day ideas, and internal creativity and innovation on the part of airmen and space professionals by having things like the Spark Tank.
Can Congress do more to support those efforts? What more can we do?
The authorities that you have granted are very helpful, and we will be looking in space to come forward with ideas that might shed more red tape that we find encumbersome.
I think one of the challenges, we actually canceled a C2 program for space that wasn't going to deliver what we needed and went to an agile development way of doing business. I think one of our challenges is we need to make sure as we do this and we spiral that we give Congress the appropriate oversight, and it's that balancing that going fast with making sure that you have what you need to make sure that we're doing well.
Appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, I yield the remainder of my time to General Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. One follow-up on the electronic warfare question. The Compass Call program, we've budgeted 10 replacements with the Gulfstream. 6 are paid for. I understand the Gulfstream production line is stopping. What is our plan to close out the last 4? Thank you, General Goldfein.
No, thanks, sir. We made a decision, business case, that said there's some mix of of used aircraft and new aircraft was the plan. So we're going to have, I think that the plan is like 6 and 4 in terms of new versus used. So the shutdown of the line doesn't affect us. We'll be able to get our aircraft we need.
Thank you. I yield back.
Great, thank you, gentlemen. Yields back. I'm going to be taking the helm here as I'm next up on the line. So I wanted to just start by echoing my colleagues, General Goldfein, just of your incredible service. It's been great getting to work with you on this. And Secretary Barrett and General Raymond, it's been great getting to know you and work alongside both of you. Secretary Barrett, I wanted to turn to you and just take a step back here. As you know, in my district, we talked about, we got Joint Base McGuire-Dix Lakehurst, and a big part of the work that I've been trying to do is just really try to harmonize the work between the Joint Base as well as the surrounding community. Certainly a big part of that has been about the community doing everything we can in New Jersey to support the Joint Base, as it's our second largest employer in the entire state of New Jersey. But another aspect of it is something about how it is that we can continue to make the Joint Base an engine for our economy in the area and continue to support our local businesses and our local efforts there. So I wanted to just start off with sort of a broad question here. I would assume you would join me in thinking that it's critically important that our Air Force and our DoD understand that the military installations need to be a vibrant part of our community. Is that right?
It's very important to us that our communities, that we be good neighbors and we be well integrated into the communities.
Yeah, it definitely seems like a relationship that we would always want to continue to be mutually beneficial on that level. One aspect that I've been looking at is in terms of military construction and military construction spending. Now, if I get these numbers right, you tell me if I'm in the right ballpark, but it looks like we're at about $2 billion in FY18 for DoD as a whole, and roughly about $265 million for FY18 for the Air Force. Does that sound in the ballpark?
Sounds in the ballpark.
Ish, yeah.
Ballpark sounds.
Well, you know, for me, as I've been digging through those numbers, I've been trying to get a sense of what kind of impact does the military construction resources and funding provide to businesses in New Jersey and local businesses, as we have a lot of great workers there who are trying to help set up the new hangars for the KC-46 and other things like that. But I've really struggled to get further details about that type of impact. So, you know, I'd like to work with you on this and try to figure out, you know, how do we do a better job of tracking what kind of investments are being made, especially when it comes to MilCon, into these local businesses. But I just want to get a sense. Does that sound like a reasonable thing that we can try to move on together here?
We're happy to work with you to try to track that.
Yeah, because I think for me, you know, we certainly want to make sure that we have, you know, the best installations, the best construction for our military. And I think that when I get to know the local workers in our area, it certainly feels like, you know, that's a place where it can be a win-win here. That our local workers who are highly skilled, a lot of them go through apprenticeships and other programs. But I'll be very honest with you, as I've talked with a number of businesses and workers in our area, they've struggled to kind of get their foot in the door, whether it's working for the Joint Base or other installations. And I'm just trying to figure out how we clarify this. You know, some of it comes from helping them understand what the contracting process is, and I think we can try to find some steps to add greater transparency on that level. But I also think that there needs to be just a sort of a reassertion of the importance that we are dealing with from this committee and from the DoD side on just what role we expect to play within our local communities. And so I think from my end, I'd love to work with you on trying to get deeper fidelity in what numbers we understand, because otherwise we have trouble quantifying and articulating exactly what kind of investment we're doing. And I'm hoping that we can work together as well to just make sure we reassert that importance of the local workers when it comes to our cooperation with the base. Does that sound right?
Congressman Kim, we'd be happy to work with you on that and to do an assessment, track it, and determine if there are better ways we can be participants in the community.
Okay, great. Well, look, I look forward to doing that with you all, and I'll yield the rest of my time here. So next up, we're going to turn it over to Mr. Mitchell. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here today. First, let me start, as some of my colleagues have referenced, in particular Kessel Run. With the Future Defense Task Force, we got to visit there. I spent 35 years in private business, running a business much smaller than the Pentagon, trust me, starting new divisions, and I was incredibly impressed with their ability to solve problems quickly. The enthusiasm level, the motivation level of both the civilians and the personnel, the active duty personnel there was extraordinary. I wish I could have spent more time. I'd have spent days there what they're working on because it really was impressive. And I want to urge that, I know there's some questions about funding and all of that, we make sure that we keep that type of operation going. I think it'd have an impact on like the problem we talked about with the F-35s using with Alice, a variety of things that they'll tackle in entirely different ways outside the box, and we're getting deliverables for the Air Force and for the military. I'd also like to switch gears a little bit. I went on a Codell, and we went to Iwakuni, was one of our stops. F-35, talked to maintainers there about Alice. We won't get into that. They had things to say, I'm sure. You can understand that. But the other concern that was raised was one about ability to train in range because of their location there and having to come back to the States or other places for training of the F-35s, which heightens my concerns about the issues of community oppositions where we bed down. We're talking about bedding down F-35s now in terms of Ops 5 and 6. As you're smiling, Secretary, yes. Without getting into what community, there's a significant backlash in the community that's scheduled to receive those. Literally, a couple hundred people last week showed up to protest that. The member of Congress in that district, I believe, would chain himself to the gates to avoid having those F-35s put there. We can invest a huge amount of money into an airplane that is, obviously, I was out at Nellis and saw the operation of that for Red Flag last year. It's extraordinary, but only if we have the proficiency of the pilots, only if we keep them trained. So my question for you is, you talked about in the Senate, and I know Senator Peters raised a question about we're looking at community interest. Can we be more specific about that? Because I don't want to put aircraft, I don't care where it is. Yes, Selfridge Air National Guard Base, I believe is a great place to put them, but we cannot put them in a place where we'll have issues of night flights being a concern, training flights, noise. There's other communities in the country that believe jet sounds are the sounds of freedom. How are you going to take that into consideration so we don't end up with a expense or an investment that's not best?
One of the most important things for training pilots is range access, and there's great range access over the lake. So it is really an important topic. There is a process that we've gone through, and so that is through measured criteria that have been pre-announced and evaluated.
Let me ask you about that.
Welcome is one of the important elements.
Let me ask you about that because I think range access is critically important. But however, it appears to me that you assess range access on a pretty general basis. And I say that because Selfridge has access directly to the largest range, both live fire ranges and terrain east of the Mississippi. I don't understand how we rate that even with other locations that have smaller ranges, less geographic diversity, less terrain diversity, and less ability for live fire. And if we're going to, again, in my opinion, make the best investment on F-35s, on this high-tech Gen 5 aircraft, let's make the best environment for them to train. So how are we going to put that into the equation so we actually assess that, in my opinion?
May I invite the chiefs to...
Absolutely. Thank you.
Hey, sir, first, let me just say thanks for bringing up Kessel Run and the work that they're doing.
Great work.
You know, while General Raymond is working on his uniform, I'm trying to figure out how to bring hoodies into the United States Air Force so we can bring in some of the most incredible software coders on the planet.
They're extraordinary. They're a lot of fun. I enjoyed those folks.
Let me tell you, though, that when it comes to the F-35 sustainment and the Alice program, the software, here's why I'm more confident today than I would have been testifying a year ago. Our folks are working now closely with the contractor and the subcontractors, and we're having one of the most mature, informed discussions we've had in this program about data. Because data is the currency of future warfare. And if we don't have access to it, then we're going to get lapped by the adversary. The fact that we're having a mature discussion with Kessel Run involved and folks who understand this business with the company that manufactures this airplane gives me my greatest optimism I've had in years.
Well, we're going to run out of time here, and I'm not going to try and abuse the acting chair, who might be less aggressive than Mr. Smith. But let me just remind you, you've heard today, Secretary and General, that there's other communities in this country that will embrace our military capabilities, the F-35, and ensure that training opportunities are available and they're not limited. And I think you've got the sense, we'll be looking at that very carefully in terms of what decisions are being made on that and how they are being made, because it's an extraordinary investment in the Gen 5 aircraft at the future of the Air Force. So please understand that oversight is going to continue. Thank you.
I know we're over time. Can I, 10 seconds? I just want to
I'm gonna
pile
have
on.
to step in here. If
I just want to pile on to
to
Kobayashi, our Kessel Run in, we have one in the Space Force called Kobayashi Maru. And I'll tell you, we just went to them and said, to both, the leaders of both, and said, design a software capability for the Space Force. And we're going to implement that going forward as well.
No, thank you. I don't want my colleagues to think I'm going to go soft on them up here. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ms. Luria, for 5 minutes. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Madam Secretary. Thank you, Generals, for being here to talk about the Air Force budget today. And I wanted to single in on a comment that stood out in General Goldfein's opening remarks. General, you said, I'm 100% confident we have what it takes to win. But when I go back to 2018, the Air Force proposed to grow its end strength to 386 operational squadrons, and then the budget request that we're looking at today doesn't get us there. And so what I'm really trying to get at is understanding, obviously, that there are limited resources, but saying like we have what it takes to win doesn't display a sense of urgency that we really need to get to 386 squadrons in order to win. And so from our perspective, when we have to make complicated choices with limited resources, what are we supposed to take away from that message?
No, ma'am, that's a great question. I think it's important for the American people to hear a Joint Chief have the confidence that we can protect this nation if called upon. And so make no mistake, it will be a long and bloody fight. We will lose a lot of airmen, but we have what we need to win. Now, the 386 operational squadrons was a discussion that we began with Congress, which was a conversation that, quite frankly, we had not been having. The first time you saw us was when we came over here to tell you the Air Force we could afford. We actually never put on the table for you the Air Force we need to win. And so 386 operational squadrons is not a gold-plated answer. When I went to war as a young captain and we kicked a non-nuclear middleweight power out of Kuwait, we had 412 operational squadrons. We're saying we need 386 to defeat a nuclear peer. It's not gold-plated. The fact that we didn't actually advance towards 386 is the reality of a flat budget with 2% less spending power.
So another comment that was made, and I appreciate that, and I understand as the chief of the service, we have confidence in our forces to execute the mission as necessary and take on all adversaries, including near-peer adversaries. But when we're looking at the budget, we want to give you the tools that you need to win. So that's kind of the discussion that we're having here, and certainly believe with full confidence in our forces' ability to fight with the tools that they currently have. But we want to know what they need for the future. And General Raymond, you mentioned in your remarks that to establish Space Force is the #1 priority of the U.S. Air Force. Just taking a step back, because the Air Force has a huge part in this, I strongly believe that modernizing the nuclear deterrent is incredibly important, and that a strong nuclear deterrent is the cornerstone of our national defense. So again, somewhat competing priorities. If we're to sit here and make decisions between things that have very large price tags, but are also very fundamental to our national defense. Can you speak briefly on that?
Yeah, so clearly the nuclear mission is the top mission in the United States Air Force. I mean, we have to absolutely do that right. We're just starting the Space Force. And so a near-term priority is to get that Space Force right, because I will tell you, it is equally critical to our security and the security of our allies. We have had the absolute luxury over the last couple decades of operating in a very peaceful, benign domain. And I would welcome the opportunity to come talk to you in a closed session about the threats that we're seeing.
No, I would enjoy that opportunity, and I also see a great opportunity for developing a service from scratch. As someone who served in the Navy for 20 years myself, when I look back, as soon as we started integrating women, we were trying to fit a different model into something that had pre-existed, but I think you have a huge opportunity, as Representative Brown said, for women, increasing diversity and all of those things, to start from scratch with a vision statement and recruiting that supports a new force with a blank slate.
Wholeheartedly agree.
And I would love to have that conversation. And switching to the next topic very quickly, climate change, sea level rise, recurrent flooding. In Hampton Roads, we have 8 major military installations. One of those is Langley Air Force Base. And your budget justification for the project that was listed there for the access control point, because if people can't get on the base, they can't get to work, they can't do their jobs, basically said that in justifying the land acquisition portion of that Langley is not within the 100-year floodplain. However, it was one of the 18 installations listed in the 2016 DoD report that were the most at risk due to flooding and other environmental issues and sea level rise. So would also love to hear more specifically about the justification for that and what we can do to make sure that our airmen can get on Langley, and also with NASA Langley facility enjoying the same access route, and they are critical to the work that we're doing on hypersonics as well.
The United States Air Force learned a great deal after Offutt Air Force Base and Tyndall were damaged in the past several years. And we have Congress to thank for funding the repair. As we rebuild, we are building to new parameters, to new guidance, and to new management, new construction models, which incorporate flooding and wind damage as elements, revised elements to build those standards. So we are, in fact, taking it very seriously that we need to make sure that our folks can get to work each day.
Okay, well,
Thank you. We've run out of time.
thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Whitman now for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Goldfein, Secretary Barrett, General Raymond, thanks again for joining us. General Goldfein, thank you so much for your extraordinary leadership and service there with the Air Force. We thank you for all that you've done. We look forward to working with General Brown. I know that he will have big shoes to fill. I want to applaud you for all you're doing to prioritize modernization within the Air Force. We know the big delta that you have been given with this and where we are today and where we need to be. And we know that during times in our military, there are these points where we have to go through pretty big efforts to be able to modernize. I know all the things that the Air Force does in this time of great power competition. The challenges we face are multifold and in many different areas. All the things that the Air Force has done in research and development in places like hypersonics, directed energy, autonomy, cyber, propulsion, mass weapon payload systems, and advanced space dominance in the future are all extraordinarily important. And you talk about multi-domain operations, taking all those things and integrating them together. And technology is fantastic, and we are the best innovators and creators in the world, but it in and of itself is not the panacea. So the question is as we're looking at all those things, how do we take all that great technology and integrate it into modernization within the Air Force, integrate it into the modernization of the Space Force, and then how do we integrate that into the Joint Force? All those different elements are a lot of different moving pieces. I think that's going to be the real secret sauce. It's been the secret sauce about how we've operated previously. That's what our adversaries don't quite get to, and it's where we're going to maintain our strategic and tactical advantage in the future. Give me some of your thoughts about how these technologies are developed quickly, and the Air Force RCO does a great job in really getting technology, getting it to the forefront, getting it out there. But how do we make sure that we're doing the right thing in testing and integrating all this different technology into systems that have significance today, tomorrow, next month, next year, and next decade?
No, thanks, sir. It's a great question. You know, industry is ahead of us on this. They've learned that if you want to do artificial intelligence, hypersonics, quantum, some of these game changers, you actually can't skip the steps of common digital architecture and data architecture. So the Department of Defense, we can't skip the step. We got to do it. Here's what gives me confidence that we're doing this the right way. Number one, Chairman Milley's guidance to me when he designated the Air Force as the service lead to work this forward was crystal clear. We are not bringing forward a single service solution. We are bringing forward a joint solution. And the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, the investments they've made in their own C2 has got to fit into anything we bring forward. That's number one. Number two, the Joint Chiefs, I will tell you now, coming up on my 4th year, it's an interesting relationship that we have now because we've all grown up fighting together. I mean, Jim McConville was the commander at Bagram when I was the air component commander. We fought together. So there's a level of trust between the Joint Chiefs that I would offer that this is the way that this committee ought to expect us to operate as Joint Chiefs, sitting here especially with my fellow Joint Chief. And the last thing I will tell you is that trust as we build this out means that I make sure that the investment that the services have made in their C2 fits into any architecture that we do. We're all going out to Nellis Air Force Base next month for a demonstration, and we're on a 4-month cycle where we're connecting capabilities and we're solving problems, and we're doing this the way that industry, and I'll finish with saying that we have brought on 12 pioneers that have done this successfully in industry. One of the designers of the Uber app actually now is on the Air Force payroll.
I appreciate all of those efforts, and I think those things are incredibly important as you transition through this modernization. One of the elements of modernization, and you point to with multi-domain operations, is transitioning from legacy systems, retiring legacy systems. The systems that we needed yesterday, last month, aren't what we're going to need next month, next year, or as I said, next decade. But give me your perspective, because it's not just retiring legacy systems, but it's making sure the transition is proper. So if we're retiring a legacy system, how do we make sure that we have in place, operationally proficient, the replacement system for that? Because I think that's what concerns all of us, is not necessarily getting rid of those systems, but making sure we have the proper ones fully operationally in place before those other ones are taken out.
Secretary Mattis used to have a framework he'd force us. If any of us said what he called the R word, the risk word, we had to answer 3 questions. To who, for how long, what's your mitigation? Yeah. This is real risk to the combatant commanders. Yeah. And I don't want to understate that to General Lyons, for me to retire tankers is real risk. Yeah. For General McKenzie, for me to retire ISR is real risk. How you mitigate is by connecting this force so that you make use of all the sensors that are now available and the ones that we're fielding, so we can go forward and do this in a way that we can do it better than we are today.
I'm going to have to cut you off there. We're going to turn it over to Mr. Brindisi. Over to you for 5.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Secretary, and both generals for being here today. I don't want to belabor the point, General Raymond, because I know you talked about this earlier, integrating National Guard units into Space Force, and as you know, National Guard units across 8 states are currently working on space-related missions, including the Triple Deuce, which is Triple Deuce Command and Control, which is in Rome, New York, and upstate New York. So I'd welcome a further conversation with you, as we discussed earlier, to talk about that integration. Thank you.
Happy to do so.
Secretary Barrett, the NDS reoriented our strategy to focus on great power competition and ensuring we stay ahead in terms of research and development of game-changing technologies like quantum science and AI. And as you know, the Air Force Research Laboratories Information Directorate in Rome, known as Rome Lab, has been at the forefront of both quantum research as well as CUAS. And I wanted to ask if you could briefly speak on how you view competition with China regarding these critical technologies like quantum and AI, and talk about your vision for how we can use our incredible DoD lab base to ensure we win this technology competition with China.
Our ability to compete against great powers, especially against China, with their use of technology and their trajectory in development, will not be possible without using quantum capabilities, without AI, and without the kind of leadership that the Rome Labs have demonstrated. We will lean upon the outcome, the product of those labs long into the future. So they are quintessentially pivotal to our future.
Do you think, just to follow up on that, do you think we're investing adequate resources fast enough to keep pace with China?
When it comes to innovation, I always feel like there isn't enough, we're not doing enough, but it is a high priority.
And can you talk a little bit about the Air Force's efforts to improve public-private partnerships and research of emerging technologies?
As Chief Goldstein demonstrated in his comments, we really are experimenting, doing new things, trying new techniques, working in partnerships that previously didn't exist. So it's really a great focus of the United States Air Force and really throughout the Department of Defense on making better use of friends, allies, partners in the United States and abroad.
Thank you. And I know I had the privilege of welcoming Secretary Wilson to Rome Lab last March. I know she was very impressed with the innovative, groundbreaking work that they're doing, and I would extend the same offer to you. I think you certainly would be very impressed by what's happening there.
Thank you. I look forward to it.
I want to shift real quick to mental health and suicide prevention. I also have the privilege of serving on the House Veterans Affairs Committee, and I appreciate in your testimony you recognize that suicide is a, quote, insidious threat to our force. and its devastating military families. I know the Air Force is focusing on suicide prevention and providing our airmen with resiliency skills, but last year, 137 airmen, active, guard, and reserve, died by suicide. Last year, the Air Force's number of suicides was the highest level in 3 decades. Can you briefly speak to what the Air Force is doing now to address this trend, and how you plan to change the Air Force's approach as you move forward here?
This is one of the scourges of our time. It is something that is devastating to the morale in our communities, and has been taken seriously, especially by Chief Goldfein during this past year, as we look to implement specific things that can help to move the needle on that. I'd invite his attention to it.
Yes, General.
Sir, suicide is killing more airmen than any adversary on the planet. It's an adversary. And the way we're attacking it and defending ourselves is through 2 primary efforts. First of all, at the institutional level, we're taking a page out of what Special Operations Command so very successfully instituted, called the Preservation of the Force and Family, and we're spreading that across the Air Force at an Operation True North. And we have money in this budget to expand that to 14 bases as we continue to expand that out. But the most important work that we're doing is at the unit level. So we asked each wing commander, active guard and reserve, to stand down their wing at a time and place of their choosing to kick off a year-long campaign to get after this adversary, make it personal, make it continuous. And so we have not seen the numbers go down yet, but we're attacking it aggressively.
Thank you, General, very much. If there's things that we can work on as a committee or even in the House Veterans Affairs Committee, I know this is an area that I have great concern, and many members do, so I appreciate your efforts in this regard. I yield back.
I agree with my colleague on just the importance of that issue and what we can do to address suicides in our services as well as with our veterans. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Kelly now. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And General Goldfein, again, thank you for your service. You've heard that, but it matters. You've made a difference in your 4 years here, and so have all the Joint Staff. I do ask that we pay attention, and we talked earlier about diversity. And I think we've got to change not just diversity in who we're getting to fly, but I think we have to change the culture. So, Madam Secretary, you've kind of faced this, and so I want you to say, what are we doing to change the culture in the Air Force so that minority and women want to be Air Force pilots?
Well, again, I would invite the comments of the chief as having been in those squadrons through his career. But first, getting the law changed was the irony that we were, for much of the Air Force's history, excluding women from the opportunity to fly high-performance aircraft. We could fly tankers and transports, but not fighters or bombers. And that took a law change, and it took bipartisan effort to get that to change. But now that means women can be there, but are they welcome and how are they included? That's been a longer challenge and a longer process. And I'd invite the chief to speak to that.
I just wanted to, and let me, Chief, I think we've got to advertise. We've got to make those young ladies and those minorities, that they see that TV commercial and they want to go fly fighters for the United States Air Force or the United States Navy, which we're not talking about now. Going back to the Joint Chiefs, you know, it really, it's probably just me, but it really bothers me that we don't have Chief National Guard Bureau sitting at the table at any point in this process. They represent a huge part of our Air Force. They represent a huge part of our Army, yet they're never in these budgetary hearings. And although it's one Army, one Air Force, one nation, they still have differing things that I think they can add something. So I hope that people are out there listening and we'll change that so they're here. General Goldfein, this is for you. I just hope I can get your commitment when we talk about modernizing C-17s, when we talk about modernizing our KC-135, 46 fleets to do our strategic air, the things that we're going to have to continue to do, the C-130J modernization that's now been turned off. I hope that we will stay committed to the Air Guard and Air Reserve to make sure that we don't promise them that we're going to modernize and then at the last minute go, well, you'll get the next go round and we'll put you at the end again. So can you tell me what we're doing to keep that on pace?
No, I can, sir. And I will tell you that, Ranking Member Thornberry brought up a comment in the beginning about CR. And so if I could take, 30 seconds and tell you, we have to acknowledge what a CR does is it keeps me from being able to do any new starts, hiring civilians, so I pretty much stop. But we don't talk enough about what it does to industry. If you're a CEO and I'm going to industry partners and I'm saying, hey, listen, I can't tell you what I'm going to buy you next year, but I need you to keep a sophisticated workforce working, and then I'm not sure exactly when I'm going to get that money. It wreaks havoc. And so much of the modernization you talk about, we require industry to be partners with us on this, and the CR affects them as bad as it affects me.
And I agree with that, but I'm taking ownership of our CR part, but they're not the one who just reallocated and not modernized. And so I think we all have to take our piece of that. And I just, the other thing I want to go back to Secretary Barrett, and we have a great female fighter pilot who trains our pilots in Columbus Air Force Base, which is in my district, Colonel Samantha Weeks. And so we need more role models like her, although I hope she's not listening, because she is not getting me up in one of those jets and making me cry.
Well, I would just tell you that you should be proud of your neighborhood in that it was Judy Dunaway, a woman from Columbus, that was instrumental in moving the law, changing the law to allow women to fly fighters and bombers.
And then just real quick, as ranking member of the Military Personnel Subcommittee, EFMP is very, very important to me. And so I want to know, Madam Secretary, what we're doing. We're currently closing Dover Air Force Base or talking about that. So now we're putting those same families out in the local community, and we're going to saturate that. What are we doing to make sure when we close MTFs that we're continuing to take care of our EFMP families and also just our regular families of all our service members?
I'll tell you that I chaired a meeting yesterday to talk on exactly that subject, and that it's not being well managed now. We need to figure out if it's too broad a category, if we're just not meeting the needs as well as we should for our families, and that's an important topic for us.
And I had one for you, General, but I'm out of time. Thank y'all so much for your service.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Spear. Over to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. To you, General Goldfein, if this is indeed your last visit, extraordinary service to our country. Thank you. To Secretary Barrett, thank you recently for your phone call. I also want to alert you to a company in my district called Zipline that is working with the Army, is providing by drones blood supply, drugs to various locales around the world, particularly in Africa right now. But I see a great resource there in terms of potentially providing spare parts to the Air Force when we have so many of our aircraft down because of maintenance issues, which takes me to the F-35 program, which I think you answered earlier. I was at the Intel Committee, and I regret I wasn't here for the response, but how are we going to sustain 2 squadrons outside of Fairbanks, Alaska, if the spare parts issue is not dealt with? Chairman.
Man, we've actually made significant progress on parts. Last two combat deployments we've taken for us with the F-35A in the Middle East and with the Marine Corps who went to the Pacific. Both of those newer aircraft were able to establish a 80 to 90% mission capable rate while they were deployed. That's dependent on parts. And where we've been focused with Lockheed Martin is looking at sustainment and scaling the sustainment enterprise so we can have the parts that we need going forward.
Are we looking at 3D printers?
We are, as a matter of fact, yes.
All right. Maybe you could, for the record, provide us some additional information of how you're utilizing that.
Absolutely.
Secretary Barrett, the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Service have recommended that all armed forces implement significant family planning, education, and provide various methods of contraception. There's a 60% higher rate of unplanned pregnancies in the military than in the regular civilian force. And 95% of all women serving are of reproductive age. So it appears the Navy and Marines are doing a better job than the Air Force and Army in this area. For instance, the Navy is promoting long-acting reversible contraception and other forms of birth control at basic training for those who want it, requiring recruits to meet individually with medical providers and providing access to contraception at sick call or walk-in clinics to help reduce unintended pregnancy rates. It is, as we all know, a readiness issue as well. And so I'm wondering, even though Dakowitz has recommended that the Navy program be implemented in all services, and there was instructions in May of 2019, what has the Air Force done in delivering this kind of benefit to its service women?
We had a conversation again on that topic just yesterday, talking about pregnancy and deployability and a variety of things. As a former member of Dakowitz, I care about their recommendations. I have not seen the reversible birth control topic, so it's something I'll take a look at.
All right. And as the chair of the Military Personnel Subcommittee, my colleague, Ranking Member Kelly, referenced the Exceptional Family Member Program. We had a hearing on this issue just a few weeks ago. We had such an overflow crowd of families that we had to access a separate room. So later this month, we're going to actually have a town hall in which we're going to hear from families. And if you are inclined to participate, we would welcome your participation. I think that one of the issues we're going to have to look at in the NDA this year is providing at each installation a legal representation, representative who can assist these families in meeting with local school districts and providing the appropriate independent education plan that they each deserve. And General Raymond, let me conclude with you. I had the privilege just last week of being at the Space Command and also at the Air Force Academy. There is so much enthusiasm for the Space Force that it's a great shot in the arm. At the time I visited, I understood that there were actually 2 persons associated with the Space Force, you and your deputy. Has that number increased at all?
Well, first of all, thank you for visiting. The team really enjoyed hosting you. There's actually 1, and that's me.
Oh.
We're about to swear in the senior enlisted advisor, which will be number 2. And then, really exciting, this May, out of the Air Force Academy,
60.
about 65, don't quote me on the number, it's 63,
60,
4,
well, they had
something
told
like
us 60 at the
will get directly commissioned into the United States Space Force. And then the rest of this, throughout the fall, we'll start transitioning more. So there's 1 person officially on the books. We have about 16,000 airmen and civilians assigned to the Space Force, and we will take portions of those and move them over onto the books of the Space Force.
Thank you.
I also want to thank you for your efforts on EFMP. It's really important. It's really important work, and I would love to come by and have an office.
Oh, would you?
Chat with that.
If you'd like to participate in the town hall, we'd enjoy having you as well. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. We're going to turn it over to Mr. Waltz now.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Acting Chairman. Appreciate it. General Goldfein, thank you for being in the fight all these years. And to you and all the airmen, I wouldn't be alive today and wouldn't be sitting here representing North Florida if it weren't for the United States Air Force. And I also want to thank you and commend you, and you as well, Secretary Barrett, for your work on light attack. We had this conversation a year ago. I just attended another Green Beret funeral yesterday from Afghanistan. This capability is, in my opinion, which we know well has been long overdue and needed. I am pleasantly just really grateful and stunned at the supersonic speed with which you have moved to put the MOU in place with SOCOM, to put the money in the FYDP and in this year's budget to transfer over to SOCOM to procure those assets. I want to be clear on one piece, because I fear there could be some confusion out there. You've had a lot of questions and talk about retiring the A-10 airframes, close air support airframe. Obviously, the light attack is an overwatch, different function. You agree with me, and I want to get out there on the record. Those are 2 totally separate, divorced, independent moves. That is not a draw. That is not a drawdown of A-10 for light attack. Those are completely separate drivers.
Completely separate.
Thank you, Chief. Secretary Barrett, I look forward to seeing you switch into space. I look forward to seeing you the renaming, and you as well, General, at the renaming of Patrick Air Force Base to Patrick Space Force Base. I understand. Apologies, I wasn't here with Representative Lamborn, but I understand from your answer to him on the command issue, you're going to open that kind of competition, for lack of a better word, but open that selection process up. I think the Futures Command process that the Army went through was very fair and reasonable and open and gave communities a chance to kind of make their case. Is that my understanding from?
That's right. In fact, we're working with the Secretary of Defense, who was part of the Futures Command process, and that is informing what we will be doing in opening the Space Command competition.
You still expect an announcement this year?
Yeah, this year. This year to announce the process and to get the process going, and a selection by the end of this year or early next year.
Great. Thank you, Madam Secretary. General Raymond, thank you for the visit yesterday. I just want to reinforce my colleagues. We talked about the Guard issue and where we are on that. I just wanted to give you a minute to talk about the space threat. There are few briefs that really make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. What our adversaries are doing in space, and I have taken it on to just help our voters, help Americans understand how dependent our economy is on space, how dependent every individual in this room is, how we touch space 20, 30 times a day without even realizing it, and how our assets have to be protected. But we have to get to a deterrence model, and we can't get to a deterrence model with our adversaries in the world understanding what we are capable of doing unless we can talk about it. And I just wanted to, over to you, General.
I really appreciate that question. Clearly, space is a war-fighting domain, just like air, land, and sea. That's why the Space Force and U.S. Space Command are so critical. We do not want to get into a fight that begins, excuse me, or extends into space. We want to deter that from happening. I think it's really important that America understands, the average American understands, just as you said, how reliant they are on space capabilities, but also the growing threat. Everything from reversible jamming of communication satellites and GPS satellites to directed energy weapons.
And when we say, just to be clear, when we say, our modern economy and society is dependent, agriculture, banking, telecommunications.
Across the board.
Weather, disaster, across the board.
Right. And so,
farming.
Yeah, so not only does it fuel our American way of life, but it also fuels our American way of war. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing that the Joint and Coalition Force does that isn't enabled by space. It's absolutely nothing.
Thank you. And just in my remaining time, if you could submit for the record, I think it's important too. I also sit on the Space, Science, Space, and Technology Committee, so I see the civilian side of what we're trying to do with the moon and space station and others, and how the Space Force and NASA are working together so that we can still operate in a challenged space, so that NASA can operate in a challenge. If you could submit that for the record.
I absolutely will. We're working closely together.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to now recognize Mr. Carbajal. Over to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to all of you, and thank you for your service, General Goldfein. I'm sad to hear that you're going to be leaving us in the near future, and as my colleague, Representative Brown said, I do hope you stay engaged, because your perspective and insight and wisdom will be greatly appreciated in a continued way. So, Vandenberg Air Force Base is located in my district. Its mission is to enable space superiority through assured access to space by providing robust, relevant, and efficient spaceport and range capabilities for our nation. I understand in November 2019, the Air Force Space Command held an interagency tabletop exercise focused on the future of military launch facilities and how they can also support growth in commercial space. To any of the witnesses, how did the exercise help the department understand what investments and policy changes are needed to meet the growing demand for space launch resources on our ranges? What are the next steps? And General Raymond, I know you commanded Vandenberg Air Force base at one point. So
Second Lieutenant Jay Raymond showed up at Vandenberg 36 years ago. Been stationed there 4 times. It's an absolutely critical place for national security and national security space. Assured access to space is a vital national interest, as laid out in the national security strategy. Vandenberg has a critical part in that, as does Cape Canaveral and others. To meet the warfighting demands of this domain and the strategic environment of this domain, we have to increase the capacity of our launches. We have to reduce the cost. We have to lower the barriers of entry into space. We have to capitalize on is a terrible word to use in the space business, but an explosion of commercial space capabilities. And so we're working on a vision for the future, a range of the future, getting after autonomous operations, being able to have plug-and-play ranges, being able to have a more resilient range, being able to increase those launch rates, reduce costs, and reduce duplication between us and, for example, the FAA that licenses commercial launches. So as we put this vision together, this tabletop exercise helped inform that vision writing.
did infrastructure come up at all in terms of the need to be able to build up?
Absolutely. You know, if you look at, I mean, I've been in the launch business for years, and historically when we conduct launch operations, because we have to be able to destroy everything that's launched for public safety if it were to go astray, we have large amounts of infrastructure, as you know, to do that launch, to support that launch. Where industry is going is that's all autonomous. That allows us to change the range, reconfigure the range very, very quickly. It reduces launch costs considerably, and I think it's what's enabling commercial space competition to come back to the United States.
Thank you, General. General Goldfein or Secretary Barrett, any other comment? Thank you. General Raymond, you have called for investments in infrastructure and changes in how ranges are managed so they are more responsive to national security and economic demands for space launch. Can you elaborate on your assessment a little bit more that we touched on just a little bit? Are you working with the ranges to identify and then prioritize the necessary infrastructure investments?
We absolutely are. My big push was to make sure that we have common architectures between both coasts to help reduce costs and reduce overhead. We also want to, through all the paperwork, to be able to get them onto the range and launch them safely. We need to speed that up. We have to get much quicker in our ability to launch. I'm excited for where we're going. We've already made significant strides. Vandenberg is a critical part of that, already made significant strides, but we have to get to plug-and-play, data-driven ranges that will enable us to do what we need to do for national security.
Thank you, General. Let me just conclude by saying the district, the stakeholders, the communities around Vandenberg are extremely excited about not only what this means for our national security, but what it will mean for our area in terms of the economy and the investments we make. So I want to thank you and ask that you please continue to consider the importance of Vandenberg as it relates to our advantage.
It's a critical strategic location and capability. Our major command and control capability for all DoD space resides on that base. It's hugely important to us.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. We're now going to recognize Mr. Scott for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Goldfein, General Raymond, Secretary Barrett, thank you for being here. I have a couple of concerns that I mentioned yesterday that I'll just state for the record, and I know the Air Force is going to give me answers on this. But moving $8 billion of the weapon system sustainment to OCO, out of base funding and into OCO, I have serious questions about that from a long-term strategy, and appreciate the opportunity to speak with you about that earlier, and look forward to more detail on that. But that's something that I think we as a committee will have to work to fix. The base funding is more stable than OCO funding, as you know, and want to speak further about that. I do want to speak briefly on the JSTARS. I'm concerned that the money for updating the Common Data Link is not enough to actually execute the program. Historically, it has been in the $20 billion level, and my understanding is the request this year is at the $3 billion level. The fiscal year 19 NDAA has said that the Air Force shall provide not fewer than 6 dedicated E-8C JSTARS aircraft each fiscal year for allocation and support to the combatant commands. There's only $11 million requested in fiscal year 21 for $11 million total for all of the upgrades and modernizations, $3 million of which, as I understand, is for the Common Data Link. I mean, do you believe this is enough to provide the combatant commanders with the 6 that are required in the fiscal year 19 NDAA?
Sir, what we funded throughout this is, as we've discussed this, that when we did the infrastructure work on the JSTARS to determine that it could fly into the late 20s, 2027 and beyond, that's what allowed us to bridge without a gap to advanced battle management system.
That's right.
The point on data links that you make, we're actually leveraging technology, and I'd actually like to sit down with you in a closed setting and walk you through where we're going with some unconventional work we're doing on data links that allow us to actually bridge between systems using some new technology that actually industry has made available. I'll just give you an example. We were able to use a Valkyrie drone to actually have F-22s and F-35s communicating through a universal translator. We're finding that we can do that more often, which is what you're seeing in some of the budget numbers.
Okay, but we do have the agreement that we're going to fly the JSTARS until ABMS has proved that it can handle
yes, sir.
The GMTI mission and the command and control aspect of war.
Yes.
And my concern is, as somebody who has both ABMS and JSTARS at their base, if we're talking about it from the soldier standpoint, my concern is that we're seeing what appears to be the starving of the JSTARS mission when we're going to have to depend on that platform at least into the 2030s, as I think there's broad agreement on. And so $11 million in upgrades and modernization is not much money when you're starting to talk about a legal requirement to maintain 6 aircraft for the combatant commanders. As you know, and this was brought up yesterday, and this has been reported widely, Breaking Defense probably had the toughest article, I think, on it, where the leadership at Army Futures and Concept Centers expressed concerns about ABMS. Can you tell me how you're working through that with the Army?
Yes, sir, and I'll tell you that I'll tell you 3 things. Number one, Chairman Milley's guidance to all of us, and certainly to me as the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, since we're responsible for leading the effort on the command and control of the joint warfighting concept, his guidance was crystal clear, which is we are not to build a single service solution. What we're to do is to preserve the investment that each service has made connecting itself, whether that's IBCS for the Army or what the Navy and the Marine Corps. Our job is to figure out, okay, how do we take that investment, preserve it, and actually connect it so we can fight better as a joint team. We're going out in April. We just completed in December our demonstration number 1. We're doing our next demonstration with all the Joint Chiefs there, and we're going to take 3 combatant commanders, of which one is at the end of the table, General Raymond, and he's going to be the supported commander for the first part of this exercise, this demonstration, and we're going to connect capabilities because he's going to need an all-domain solution for a problem that he's given in this demonstration. Then we're going to shift to General O'Shaughnessy for defense of the homeland, and then we're going to shift to the Stratcom commander. All the services are going to be represented, and we're going to be doing live fly. We're going to be doing live fly at White Sands Missile Range with the Army, live fly Yuma at with the Marine Corps, live with the Navy off the Gulf Coast, and live with the Air Force at Nellis. So this is going to be a big demonstration, and we're doing this every 4 months to make sure that we bring this together for the entire joint team.
Well, I appreciate your comments, and thank you for your service. I just make sure we're moving in that direction with the integration of all of the services as we develop this system.
Sir.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Holland for 5 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you, Chairman. And General Goldfein, Secretary Barrett, and General Raymond, welcome to our committee hearing. I first want to say that I'm appreciative of the conversation about women and people of color to find success in the ranks of our armed forces, specifically pilots. And as one of the first Native American women ever elected to Congress in our country's history, I completely understand when there's no role models to see in those areas that it's hard for young women to believe that they can achieve those goals. So I feel like once we get it started, it will change the trajectory of what we're trying to do. So I appreciate your commitment to seeing that through. Secretary Barrett, I'll start with you. You recently spoke about flat budgets being a reality the department must face, and that your OSD leadership have made it a priority to seek the best value for every dollar in the budget. In my own district, there are valuable resources not fully used, from empty ramp space, hangars, and ops facilities to talented citizen airmen that cannot deploy. There is untapped potential available to meet Air Force needs. The New Mexico Air National Guard is currently organized with no aircraft assigned there, and over 300 airmen currently do not contribute to service readiness recovery efforts. In fact, more than a third of the airmen assigned to the 150 Special Operations Wing are in non-deployable billets with zero operational requirements. This issue has limited the New Mexico Air National Guard in developing the future commanders needed to lead the wing and forced our state to look to other states to fill these roles. Given your role in organizing, supplying, equipping, and training our brave airmen, what efforts are being made to identify Guard and Reserve capabilities that are currently underutilized throughout the Air Force?
Thank you, Ms. Holland, for that comment. And let me just say on your first point that I am flanked by two people who really do care about people's capability rather than whether it's what gender or what color people are. We happen to have leadership that's very caring and inclusive, so that's a help.
Yes.
On the topic of Guard utilization, that's, I'll have to take a closer look at it and get back with you on especially the New Mexico utilization rates.
Ma'am, can I just?
May I ask the chief to?
Ma'am, I'll just tell you that it should not be lost on you that probably one of the most important hires that we have made as an Air Force is our Director of Legislative Liaison, who's here, Major General Select Chris Finnerty, who is an Air National Guardsman, who speaks on behalf of the entire United States Air Force when we present to you our budget. I have stopped meetings, not many, because the word got out. I have stopped meetings in the Pentagon when I looked around and I did not see Lieutenant General Rice or the Director of the Air National Guard or the Commander of the Air Force Reserves in the meeting. We don't have meetings, especially on budget topics, if they're not in the room. And so you have our commitment to ensure that this one Air Force is going to move forward together.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And General Goldfein, I'll go next to you. I want to take a moment to talk about a group of airmen that I know are near and dear to your heart and your vision for the future of the Air Force Special Warfare missions. As you know, our PJs and combat rescue officers are elite warriors and the only U.S. force dedicated to combat search and rescue operations. They spend 2 years completing the rigorous training course after another to earn the Maroon Beret and the PJ distinction. They spend the bulk of that time training at Kirtland Air Force Base, which is also in my district. We are proud to be the home of the Pararescue School and are eager to see their full campus, including a suitable range and operations facility, come to fruition. What's your vision for the future of the special warfare community and the role of these elite airmen in joint all-domain operations?
Well, ma'am, first of all, thanks for your advocacy for that group. I wouldn't be sitting here today if it weren't for them. You know, these things they do that others may live, I'm one of them. So our vision for the future is to ensure that, quite frankly, they have what they need to succeed. But not only in the fight of today and the one we've been in for the last 19 years, but just as importantly, they're doing a lot of creative thinking right now on what does combat search and rescue look like in 2030. And it actually brings forward capabilities that we're doing some exciting work on. And one of the individuals involved in that is our Chief of Acquisition, Dr. Will Roper, who is doing some really creative work, building actually new industries out there with bringing them in for pitch days and for small business contracts so we can provide technology very quickly to our frontline warfighters.
Thank you so much, and Chairman, I yield.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Hartzler. Over to you for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you very much. And I want to be the last member but of this committee to certainly wish you well, General Goldfein. It has been an honor to get to know you, and I appreciate your service as well as your wives and your families all this year. So hope that we will continue to see you and glean from your knowledge into the future. And I know the men and women and the airmen of Whiteman Air Force Base have appreciated your support as well. And Secretary Barrett and General Raymond, I look forward to continuing to work with you and appreciate all of your service as well. Wanted to talk about the mix that we discovered last year and I supported of 4th and 5th gen aircraft. And I know, General Goldfein, you had a quote last year. You said, we're going to be mixed well in the 2030s of 4th gen and 5th gen fighters, and they complement each other. 1 + 1, 4th gen plus 5th gen actually equals 3 fighters if they're used correctly, because they each make each other better. And I certainly agree with that. However, now that we've seen the new budget, I was surprised to see a decrease of $300 million and 6 F-15EX aircraft that were originally planned to be in this budget. So I guess, do you still stand behind last year's comments about the benefits of both? And could you speak to the justification for decreasing those aircraft?
Yes, ma'am, I stand by that 100%, and we're still committed to, we're committed to the F-35 program of record, and we're committed to the F-15EX program as well. A flat budget with 2% less spending capacity requires us to do some trades, and the F-15EX that you talked about were one of those trades.
Okay, very good. Well, it's not very good, but appreciate your explanation. So one of my other colleagues mentioned a very important topic, and I know Secretary Barrett, you weighed in as well as General Goldfein about how important it is that we go after the suicide problem, and I appreciate your attention to that. I just wondered if, as you're looking at all the different options, if you are considering faith-based nonprofit programs as part of the options for our airmen who are in need of hope and healing. I've been looking at a lot of different options to go after this problem, and I've been very encouraged by a lot of nonprofit organizations out there. They're doing amazing work with sometimes 100% success rate for the individuals who go through these programs, and right now I don't see those as being integrated into our military or made available to them. So are you exploring those options as well?
I'll ask the chief to address it.
Sure.
Ma'am, I'll tell you what, on this one, there is no bad idea. We're actually looking everywhere. Marine Corps has actually had, they've had an interesting program that we're looking into now as well. And so as we go after this, and I said, again, you know, suicide's an adversary, right? It's taken more airmen than any adversary on the planet. We're attacking it primarily through engaged leadership at the unit level. We think that's where it's going to have the most impact. And so what we're doing with the tools that we're putting available is making sure at the local level that they have access to some of these best ideas. I'd love to come by and talk to you about what you're seeing and see if we can bring as many of these nonprofits into our businesses as possible, because we got to keep it fresh and we got to keep it personal.
Yes, absolutely. And I think holistic, which these programs encompass, not just the mental and physical issues, but also the spiritual of the heart. So, yeah, I look forward to that discussion. I wanted to shift a little bit to what I learned last week on a Codell out to Beale Air Force Base with my colleagues Donald Norcross and John Garamendi. We met with the 9th Reconnaissance Wing and the 12th Reconnaissance Squadron, who fly the Global Hawk Block 20s and Block 30s. The budget request this year proposes to divest the entire fleet of Block 20 and Block 30 Global Hawks, so that's 4 and 20 systems respectively, as you know. And I'm concerned about the ISR risks that we may be accepting here because the Block 20s are critical communication gateways that are being used extensively, as you know, in SITCOM. The Block 30s are conducting missions in almost every geographical region of the world. So would you please elaborate on what's driving this decision to divest these critical ISR assets, and are there alternatives that we can use to address this loss in capacity, and how did you coordinate this decision with the combatant commands in 10 seconds.
Yeah. Thanks, ma'am. So with the combatant commanders, I'll just tell you that this is the tension that you always see. Combatant commanders got about a 2-year problem that they got to fix, and they got a real mission. And I'm looking at building an Air Force with Chief Raymond, Air and Space Force for 2030. So that tension is always there. We're keeping the U-2 flying. You'll see the money in there to sustain the U-2 flying for high altitude operations. It has the size, weight, and power to be able to do even more things than it's doing today. We're buying capability on the classified side that I'd like to come by and talk to you in a closed session that offsets some of the risk. And perhaps some of the most important work that we're doing is that every platform, sensor, or weapon that we field across all the services, not just the Air and Space Force, is a sensor, is a computer, and if we can connect them together with common digital engineering and common data architecture, we actually get more capacity just by getting more use out of what we have. All that comes together to be able to mitigate the risk.
Great.
As a combatant commander and a service chief, I feel that tension every day, and I get to write myself letters and say, why did you do that? Because on my one hat, I am looking at that near-term risk. On the other hat, we're looking to build and get to the future faster.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Well, with no one else lined up for questions, I just wanted to take this time again to just thank the three of you for coming out here today. As you can see, a wide range of issues that we're excited to work with you on. And as someone who's worked alongside the Air Force for a number of years, it's just my great honor to continue to do so. Again, just conclude by saying, General Goldfein, thank you so much for your service. I know you're going to desperately miss these types of hearings in your retirement, but I'm just grateful for you coming out one more time and sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. With no further business in front of the committee, we're now adjourned. Thank you.